Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In feudal Japan, you don't wake up and choose your path. You wake up, and it's already been chosen by birth, by blood, and by people who've been dead for 6 generations. Your role in society isn't a suggestion, it's a life sentence. Were you born into a samurai family? Lucky you. You're now responsible for the blade, the bow, and 10,000 ways to sit properly in front of your lord. Born a peasant? Congratulations. You'll be spending the next 40 years ankle deep in mud. And your children will too. Forever. There is no resume. There is no. Start your own business. You're either a samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant. And once you're placed, you stay there. Trying to jump ranks isn't just frowned upon. It's punishable. You don't climb the ladder in feudal Japan. You bow to it. And we haven't even gotten to the ETA, the untouchables. These are the people who deal with death. Butchers, executioners, leatherworkers. Society needs them, but pretends they don't exist. They're like ghosts with jobs. Important jobs, but ghosts. Even within classes, it gets worse. Let's say you're a merchant, which sounds decent, right? You've got coins, but in feudal Japan, you're near the bottom. Why? Because you make money without labor, which is considered morally shady. Yes, you're literally too efficient to be respected. Meanwhile, the peasants are taxed so hard on their rice that if they cough up too much, they starve. If they hide some to survive, that's treason. Heads roll often. Samurai, you've got honor, but you're living in constant fear of disrespecting your lord, your ancestors, your tailor, or your sword by accidentally sneezing at the wrong time. Women, you didn't even ask. But no, you're not getting out of this either. Whatever your class is, your freedom ends where your father's opinion begins. You'll marry who you're told, obey whom you must, and thank the heavens if you're allowed to learn poetry. So yes, you're born, assigned a costume and a script, and shove onto the stage of society, whether you want to perform or not. It's elegant, poetic, and crushingly inescapable. And that's all before you've had breakfast. You might think feudal life was all grit and grime, but Japan took cleanliness seriously, painfully seriously. In fact, it was practically a religion, which sounds lovely until you experience it in winter. You begin your day by washing, not in a cozy tiled bathroom with a warm towel and cucumber soap, but a stone basin filled with ice-cold water fetched from a well or stream. There's no heating. There's no negotiating. You splash your face and arms, shivering as if the ancestors are punishing you for having pores. Soap only if you're rich. And even then, it's made from ash or rice bran and smells like something a monk invented as a test of character. In rural areas, the local bathhouse, if you're lucky enough to have one, becomes the heart of hygiene. The communal scene is heated by firewood and filled with villages. And by communal, we mean absolutely no privacy whatsoever. You bathe next to your neighbors, boss, future in-laws, and maybe your landlord, completely naked. In silence, pretending this isn't awkward. You scrub first, then soak. Cleanliness is sacred. Dirtying the bathwater. Social suicide. But if you're not near a bathhouse, then you wash what you can. When you can, you clean your teeth with salt or a twig. Your nails are kept neat. Your clothes are regularly aired. You do this not because it's trendy, but because being unclean is seen as shameful, spiritually and socially. And if you're a samurai, multiply the pressure. Your lord might inspect you head to toe at any time. Dirty fingernails, dishonor, wrinkled robe, disrespect, too much body odor during a bow. You might not get back up again. Women expected to smell like cherry blossoms in discipline. Bathing is ritualized. Skin care is practiced with military precision. And hair is maintained in elaborate styles that take hours. Also, you can work a rice mortar and still look dignified doing it. So yes, feudal Japan was clean, very clean. But it came at a price. Freezing water, endless grooming, and the constant soul-shrinking awareness that someone was definitely judging your foot hygiene. Let's say you're born into the warrior class, the samurai. Sounds cool, right? Fancy swords, silk robes, poetic sword fights under cherry blossoms. Now let's talk about the fine print. Being a samurai in feudal Japan isn't about swinging a katana and shouting for honor. It's about never, ever screwing up. The entire framework of your life is governed by Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code of conduct so strict even your ancestors are nervous. You don't live for yourself. You live for your daimyo, your lord. His word is law. His moods are weather patterns, and your job is to serve him with such loyalty that you'd rather die horribly than disappoint him mildly. No pressure. Disobedience. Dishonor. Failure. Dishonor. Raising your voice inappropriately. Dishonor. Looking at the wrong person sideways during a tea ceremony. You guessed it. Dishonor. And dishonor isn't something you walk off. It's something you're expected to atone for, usually with your own intestines. That's not a metaphor. That's seppuku, the ritual suicide expected of disgraced samurai. You kneel, pull out a short blade, and let's stop there. You get the idea. This wasn't rare. It was a respected, even celebrated way to preserve dignity. Mess up badly enough, and your lord might give you a short blade in a quiet room and say you know what to do. On top of that, samurai were expected to train constantly. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, strategy, calligraphy, poetry, all while maintaining perfect posture and the expression of a man who's never known joy. Just a deep sense of obligation. Laughing too loud, unrefined, showing fear, weakness, getting emotional. Shameful. Your clothes are precise, your sword must be spotless, and your conduct must be so honorable it makes other people uncomfortable. And if you ever raise your sword in anger without cause, insult a superior, or lose a duel, you don't just lose. You lose everything. Being a samurai isn't about glory. It's about discipline, silence, and surviving each day without blinking wrong. So yes, you look good in armor, but your one eyebrow twitch away from existential catastrophe. So you weren't born as samurai. No sword, no poetry, no chance of dramatic ritual disembowelment. That's the good news. The bad news: you're a peasant, which means your entire existence is a combination of dirt, sweat, back pain, and government-mandated rice delivery. You wake up with the sun, not because you're one with nature, but because the land tax doesn't pay itself. And also, your thatched hut has no doors, no windows, and someone's goat just walked across your bed mat. Breakfast. If you're lucky, a bowl of rice porridge and a side of last week's pickled something. If you're unlucky, pretend you're not hungry with a splash of river water. Then it's off to the rice fields, which sound peaceful in travel documentaries, but are in reality mud pits designed to break your soul slowly over 12 hours. You plant, you eat, you hope a bandit raid doesn't happen today. And when the sun goes down, you limp home, only to discover that one of your oxen is missing, and the village headman would like to speak with you about your grain shortfall. Taxes are relentless. You don't get paid in coins. You pay them with rice. Your family eats what's left, which isn't much, especially if the harvest was bad, or if your lord's nephew accidentally rode a horse through your plot during a military drill. Want to complain? That's adorable. You can't. Talking back gets you whipped, exiled, or promoted to corpse. If you're really lucky, you might become a village elder, which means people still don't listen to you. But now ask for your advice right before ignoring it. And remember, you're legally not allowed to leave your village without permission. You are, in effect, a rice-based prisoner with seasonal ankle rot. Festivals? There are some. You get drunk on weak sake, dance in a circle, and try not to think about how planting season starts again in 4 days. So yes, you are the foundation of the economy, the reason the samurai eat, and the person everyone forgets exists. And no, you do not get a day off. Because feudal Japan believes in hard work, generational suffering, and keeping expectations extremely, extremely low. You're hungry. Of course you are. You've been tilling, planting, sweating, and politely not dying since sunrise. Time to eat. But in feudal Japan, meals aren't about indulgence. They're about survival, simplicity, and not choking on a fish bone in front of your in-laws. If you're a peasant, your diet is rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, rice for dinner. If you're lucky, it's actual rice. If you're not, it's barely pretending to be rice. You might get a turnip or two, some pickled radish if the gods are in a good mood. Meat, that's for the daimyo, or for that one chicken that looked at you funny and mysteriously disappeared. Fish, sometimes, but it's dried, salted, and sharp enough to file your teeth. Soup, usually miso, if you can call hot salt water with 2 floating leaves of soup. It's flavorful, yes, in the same way sea water is hydrating. Now, if you're a samurai, you do get better food, but you also eat last after your lord, his guests, and anyone he feels like impressing. That means cold rice, cold soup, and the eternal joy of watching other people eat while pretending you're deeply honored to wait also. Everything is seasonal. Not because it's trendy, but because there's no refrigeration, no global supply chain. And if you don't harvest it yourself, it probably doesn't exist. So when it's winter, that's just nature's way of suggesting fasting. And heaven forbid you get food poisoning. Medical care is optimistic. The local remedy is to lie down and think about your ancestors. You'll either get better or become one of them. Food theft is a serious crime. Steal a bowl of rice and you're not getting a slap on the wrist. You're getting a public display of why we don't touch daimyo's daikin. Tea. It's around, but not like you're imagining. The tea ceremony is a complex performance that's more about posture, etiquette, and existential humility than actually quenching thirst. So yes, meals are sacred, quiet, and respectful, but mostly they're bland small, and contain at least one crunchy mystery item. And no, you can't complain. Not unless you want your next meal served through your nose. So you've just finished your modest bowl of crunchy, maybe fish soup. Someone says something absurd. Maybe your lord mumbles a bad haiku. Maybe your village elder misquotes a proverb. Maybe your neighbor insists his cow can predict the weather. And for one reckless, foolish moment, you think about correcting them. Don't. In feudal Japan, your opinion is a liability. Free speech is not a concept. It's a fast track to disgrace, exile, or sudden career-ending decapitation. The social hierarchy is rigid, and every word has a weight. Speak above your class. You're being impudent. Criticize someone above you. You're insolent. Make a joke that doesn't land. That's treason adjacent. Even within families, you tread carefully. A son doesn't interrupt his father, a wife doesn't correct her husband, and no one, absolutely no one, questions the daimyo unless they've always wanted to explore the afterlife via sword tip. Samurai are trained to speak with measured calm, even when furious. A sharp tongue is worse than a dull blade. It's unbecoming, it's dangerous, and it might force someone into the awkward position of having to kill you to restore their honor. Which brings us to apologies. In feudal Japan, apologies are an art form. You don't just say sorry. You bow, you grovel. You possibly write a poem about your shame. You might even send a gift, like a live bird or a decorative comb, while sincerely hoping the person receiving it doesn't decide to duel you anyway. And God's help you if your tone is too casual. A misplaced word can be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or spiritual rot. Silence is almost always safer. Even humor is a tightrope walk. Laughing at the wrong thing could be seen as disrespect. Laughing with someone important might imply you think you're on their level. And that's how people end up mysteriously reassigned to the far north. So yes, you're free to speak technically, but in practice you nod, smile, and pray your opinion never tries to escape your mouth. Because in feudal Japan, loose lips don't just sink ships. They sink social standing, reputations, and sometimes your entire bloodline. In feudal Japan, fashion isn't about self-expression. It's about making sure everyone knows exactly how far below them you are just by looking at your sleeves. Your clothing doesn't reflect your personality. It reflects your position, your purpose. And whether or not you're legally allowed to carry a sword without getting tackled by a samurai, let's start at the top. Samurai wear layers of silk robes, sometimes armored, always dignified. Their outfits are carefully arranged to signal status and readiness. The colors, deep blues, earthy browns, and the occasional blood red flourish, elegant, ominous, and almost always implying I have killed a man for less than a fashion faux pas. And of course, the swords. A samurai's daisho, the paired long and short swords, is more than a weapon set. It's a walking badge of authority. Drawing one in public is a last resort. Wearing them improperly is a first step toward being publicly corrected with extreme sharpness. Peasants, on the other hand, wear cotton and humility. Brown, gray, and beige dominate your wardrobe. It's not because they're minimalists. It's because dyed fabric costs money, and you're too busy surviving to worry about coordinating hues. Your outfit says, yes, I work in mud. No, I didn't choose this lifestyle. Yes, these are my only sandals. Merchants wear finer materials. They have money after all, but they're still socially ranked below samurai and peasants, so they keep it muted. Rich, but not too rich. Still, yes, but subdued. Wealthy merchant families are experts at looking just respectable enough not to get noticed by a bored samurai on patrol. Artisans and craftsmen dress neatly but modestly. Their clothing is durable, practical, and most importantly, unobtrusive. Drawing attention to yourself is considered a personality defect. And then there are women who must strike a delicate balance between grace, obedience, and wearing 12 pounds of folded symbolism. Hairstyles are coded, kimono patterns are seasonal, and if you wear a color meant for a different festival, congratulations, you've just dishonored your entire household and possibly started a neighborhood whisper war. In short, what you wear isn't just about clothing. It's about rank, ritual, and surviving daily judgment from both heaven and your mother-in-law. So you're imagining moonlit walks beneath cherry blossoms, whispered poetry under paper lanterns, perhaps a dramatic kiss between a samurai and a forbidden princess. Yeah, no. In feudal Japan, love is a side quest, and not one you're likely to complete. Marriage isn't about feelings. It's about alliances, status, rice taxes, and not embarrassing your ancestors. If you're a peasant, your marriage is arranged by your parents and maybe the village elder. Romantic compatibility isn't discussed. Sturdy legs and healthy teeth are considered more important. If you're from a samurai family, the stakes are even higher. Marriages are tools of politics. Your partner is chosen to solidify a clan alliance, secure land, or pay off a grudge with a nice kimono. The goal isn't happiness, it's stability, ideally one that doesn't collapse during harvest season. Love letters. Maybe, but only if they're written in perfect calligraphy, using the appropriate seasonal metaphors and passed along discreetly by a maid who definitely knows too much. Women, of course, have even less say. A samurai daughter may be married off at 15, required to master calligraphy, etiquette, needlework, and the fine art of never expressing disappointment out loud. Her job is to bear sons, serve tea, and absolutely never fall in love with a flute teacher. Actual romantic love, the kind with stolen glances and passionate declarations, is the domain of poets, theater plays, and tragic ghost stories. If you want to experience love in feudal Japan, you'll need to watch a no-drama about two doomed lovers who turn into mist. And if you try to step outside your assigned relationship structure, good luck. Adultery can lead to exile, disgrace, or death by sword-related disapproval. The punishment might be carried out by your spouse, your lord, or your in-laws, whoever gets there first. Even for samurai, taking a concubine was common, but that didn't make things easier. It just added more people to disappoint silently. So yes, people fell in love, secretly, painfully, occasionally with the wrong person, and always at the worst possible time. Because in feudal Japan, love wasn't forbidden. It was just dangerously inconvenient. In feudal Japan, death isn't a distant concept. It's your neighbor, your coworker, your roommate who never pays rent but is always around. You don't plan for retirement, you plan for your exit. Because death isn't a tragedy here. It's part of the script. Let's start with the samurai. These honorable warriors walk around with 2 swords and a personal death plan. If they lose a battle, seppuku, insult their honor. Seppuku, spill sake on the daimyo's robe. Seppuku with dramatic background music. And it's not private. It's public, ceremonial, and performed with the same precision as a tea ceremony. but with significantly more internal bleeding. But don't think peasants are getting a longer life. If you're a farmer and the rice harvest fails, you're starving. If your village can't meet its tax quota, your head might be used to make a very stern point. Drought, plague, bandit raid. Pick your flavor of sudden demise and good luck fighting any of it when your most advanced medicine is warm tea and a strong belief in herbal optimism. Speaking of bandits, they're real, they're everywhere, and they don't care that you spent all year growing those daikon radishes. The roads outside towns are so dangerous that people just don't travel unless absolutely necessary. The phrase "maybe we'll visit your cousin next year" actually means I enjoy being alive. If you're a woman, childbirth is a dice roll. Complications? Too bad. Midwives are helpful, but surgical options are mostly harder. Then boil another towel. If your husband dies in disgrace, you might be expected to follow him. Not emotionally, but literally with a dagger. And let's not forget nature itself. Earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, famines. Japan is a disaster artist. Your home could be washed away or buried at any time, and the only insurance policy is a well-tied roof and deep spiritual acceptance. But perhaps the darkest part, you're expected to accept it all calmly. Wailing in fear or fighting fate is considered undignified. A real hero bows before death, composes a poem, and meets their end like it's just another awkward dinner with your clan. So yes, feudal Japan is beautiful, but mortality is part of the decor. In modern life, you're told to follow your dreams, be your own person, and live your truth. In feudal Japan, your truth is whatever your clan tells you it is. Individualism isn't a virtue. It's a red flag. You exist not as a lone star of destiny, but as a very small branch on a very important family tree. And your job is to keep that tree from catching fire due to any embarrassing behavior, like expressing opinions or falling in love with a merchant's daughter. Your clan is everything. Your identity, your reputation, your future. It all flows through your family name. You are part of a web of obligations, honor, and expectations so dense it might as well be a spiritual spreadsheet. Even the samurai, proud, honorable warriors, don't fight for themselves. They fight for their daimyo, their household, their ancestors. And if they die, ideally it's in a way that makes everyone above them look great. Because dying with honor is one thing, but dying in a way that slightly embarrasses your clan? That's the stuff of generational nightmares. Your actions reflect on your father. Your father's actions reflect on your grandfather. Your grandfather's actions may still be affecting how your cousin is treated in the next province over. It's not guilt by association. It's life by association. Want to open a noodle shop because you love cooking? That's adorable. Unfortunately, your clan raises horses, so you'll be brushing hooves until further notice. Express interest in painting. Excellent. You'll be decorating the temple your family sponsors with strict guidelines and total silence. And don't even think about the scandal. One poorly timed affair, drunken incident, or public poem with too much sass and the shame hits everyone. Your siblings shunned. Your mother was mortified. Your great-uncle might have to disembowel himself just to restore the family's good standing. You are not a person. You are a representative, a chess piece, and a liability with legs. But hey, if you play your role well, bow at the right times, and marry who you're told, your clan might just speak your name with something resembling pride. And that's the feudal Japanese version of a personal achievement badge. Let's say you survived the social hierarchy, the sword duels, the honor system, and the rice tax. Congratulations. Now try surviving the weather. Feudal Japan is a masterpiece of natural beauty. Snow-capped mountains, serene forests, blooming cherry blossoms, and an absolute nightmare of environmental chaos. The scenery is gorgeous. The climate wants you dead. Start with typhoons, massive storms that arrive like angry gods, bringing rain, wind, and the structural integrity of a rice paper wall. Roofs fly off. Roads vanish. The rice you spent all season planting, floating gently downstream. Then there are earthquakes, sudden, violent, and completely unpredictable. There's no warning siren, no alert system, just a faint rumble, a brief moment of existential confusion. And then your house is sideways. If you survive the shaking, you still have to worry about fires, because everything is made of wood, including your bad decisions. Flooding is common. Too much rain, and the rivers swell. Your village becomes a muddy soup bowl. Your crops drown. Your animals wander off. Your landlord still wants taxes, of course, now with interest. Droughts are just as cruel. Weeks of punishing sun and no rain leave the land cracked, and the rice fields dry as a monk's humor. You pray to the gods. You do rituals. You start eyeing the neighbor's well with deep suspicion. And then there's winter. Not a snowy wonderland. More like bone-deep cold, thin blankets and fires that burn out by midnight. Heating isn't central. It's communal suffering. You warm your hands over a clay brazier and hope frostbite isn't fashionable this year. Even volcanoes occasionally join the party. Japan is part of the Ring of Fire. And yes, that's just as fun as it sounds. Eruptions could bury entire regions in ash, lava, or the awkward realization that your shrine is now a rock garden. There's no FEMA, no national relief effort. If your house collapses, you rebuild it. If your food spoils, you go hungry. And if your lord's estate is also affected, well, you still owe taxes. Disaster, after all, is not an excuse. In feudal Japan, nature isn't a background element. It's an ever-present reminder that even the gods might be having a bad day. In feudal Japan, power flows downhill, and so do responsibilities, expectations, and blame. You think you're important? Think again. There is always someone above you. Let's say you're a peasant. Your life is governed by the village headman who answers to the local samurai, who answers to the daimyo, who answers to the shogun, who may be possible, whispers to the emperor, who doesn't rule so much as haunt the capital in expensive robes. Even the samurai, fierce sword-carrying enforcers of justice, aren't the top. They spend their lives serving a lord, waiting for orders and occasionally fighting in battles they didn't start over land they don't own for glory they'll never personally receive. In theory, they're honored in reality. They're very well-dressed middle management with a katana. The daimyo, those powerful lords who control provinces and armies, might seem untouchable until the shogun decides they're getting too bold. Then suddenly their castles are being inspected, their letters intercepted, and their heads very gently removed from their political ambitions. Even the shogun, the military dictator, the most powerful man in Japan, has to keep his eye on the court. The clans, the economy, and at least 4 cousins trying to poison his tea. He rules, yes, but he doesn't sleep well. Meanwhile, the emperor technically outranks everyone, but has no actual power. He's like a sacred relic you can't touch but also can't ignore. He blesses rituals, names errors, and occasionally writes poetry. He's also probably broke. This hierarchy isn't flexible. You don't climb it. You are placed. And you stay put like an overly obedient bonsai tree. Ambition isn't admired, it's feared. The higher you rise, the closer you get to a sword in your back. Respect is demanded upward and authority is enforced downward. Orders are obeyed, not discussed. Disagreements are dangerous. And any hint that you think you're above your station, that's not ambition. That's a death wish in formal attire. So wherever you are, peasant, merchant, samurai, or lord, someone above you controls your fate, and someone below you is hoping you trip. In feudal Japan, what you learn, and whether you learn anything at all, depends entirely on where you sit on the social ladder. Spoiler: if you're near the bottom, the ladder is mostly invisible and occasionally on fire. Let's start at the top. Samurai children. They're the lucky ones. From a young age, they're trained in reading, writing, swordsmanship, etiquette, poetry, archery, horseback riding, and the ancient art of looking unimpressed at all times. The samurai boy learns how to compose a death poem by 14. You were just figuring out cursive. Their education is rigorous, but with a clear purpose to serve, protect, and not embarrass the clan. They study Chinese classics, Bushido principles, and how to bow so precisely that the gods take notes. Then there are merchant and artisan families. They get some education, usually math record keeping, maybe a bit of reading, but only what's necessary for business. You're not reading Confucius. You're learning how to calculate the cost of pickled turnips in bulk. Practical. Yes. Glorious. Not really. Peasant children. Education looks like this. This is a hoe. This is rice. Now start working before the sun beats us to it. Your parents teach you how to farm, how to survive, and how to politely not die in front of the tax collector. Literacy is rare. Schooling is a luxury. The only scroll you'll read is the one nailed to a tree, explaining why your taxes just went up again. And girls, unless you're from a high-ranking family, you don't get much formal education at all. You're trained in domestic skills, sewing, etiquette, tea ceremonies, and how to maintain silence while maintaining a household. If you're really fortunate, you might learn calligraphy or poetry, as long as it doesn't distract you from folding laundry with spiritual precision. Education in feudal Japan isn't about personal growth. It's about fulfilling your role without asking questions. The idea of learning for fun would make most elders faint into their sake cups. So yes, knowledge is power, which is exactly why they kept it so tightly controlled. Feudal Japan is a land of breathtaking aesthetics. Everything, from the curve of a fan to the placement of a teacup, seems designed to soothe the soul and impress your ancestors. But here's the catch. You can and will be judged for doing it wrong. Culture in feudal Japan isn't just art. It's performance with consequences. The way you arrange flowers, pour tea, or fold a kimono isn't left to whimsy. It follows strict codes that have been around longer than your entire bloodline. One misplaced blossom and suddenly you're the talk of the village, and not in a fun, flirty way. Take the tea ceremony, for example. It looks like a quiet, peaceful ritual. In reality, it's a social minefield. Everything is timed. Every movement is choreographed. The guest must sit just so, turn the cup twice, express humble gratitude, and drink in silence, all while mentally calculating whether they bowed too early, too late, or too enthusiastically. Make a mistake? At best, it's awkward. At worst, it's seen as a character flaw or a moral failing passed down from your disgraceful great-granduncle. Then there's calligraphy, a beautiful form of expression, right? Wrong. It's a test of discipline, personality, and the alignment of your inner spirit. That brush stroke isn't just ink, it's a reflection of your soul's posture. Messy handwriting. Might as well wear a sign that says emotionally unstable and bad at bowing. Even poetry is dangerous. You don't just write a haiku. You write it in the proper season on the correct type of paper, using metaphor that references both nature and your emotional landscape without getting too personal, too passionate. You lack refinement. Too dry. You're spiritually cold. Too clever. You're showing off, and now no one's inviting you to the moon viewing party. Culture here is a delicate game. You participate not to relax, but to prove that you are composed, refined, and deathly afraid of appearing uncultured. Beauty in feudal Japan isn't effortless. It's a battlefield in silk ropes. And if your ikebana arrangement doesn't follow the rules, well, may the gods have mercy on your bonsai. After all we've seen, the hierarchy, the hygiene, the honor, the endless rice. Let's be honest, you wouldn't last a day in feudal Japan. Not because you're weak, not because you're soft, but because this wasn't a society designed for survival. It was one designed for submission, precision, and quiet, relentless obedience. Every moment was a test of posture, of loyalty, of whether or not you bowed at precisely the correct depth while reciting a seasonal greeting in the right emotional tone. If you failed, there were consequences. Public shame at best, ritual death at worst. There were no days off, no just being yourself. You were born into a role, handed a script, and expected to perform it with deadly elegance for the rest of your life. Deviating wasn't seen as brave. It was seen as dangerous. The individual didn't matter. The clan did. The lord did. The land did. If you were a samurai, you carried the weight of centuries of honor and the very real threat of having to recite poetry before slicing open your own abdomen. If you were a peasant, you worked the land from dawn until your spine became a question mark, hoping the weather didn't betray you or your lord didn't. If you were a woman, your life was a carefully managed exercise in grace, silence, and sacrifice. And if you were anyone else, well, the system was designed to make sure you stayed exactly where you were. Feudal Japan was beautiful. Yes, breathtakingly so. The architecture, the rituals, the poetry, the art, all meticulously curated. But that beauty came with sharp edges. It required discipline so tight it could snap bones. It demanded respect so absolute it swallowed individuality whole. So no, you wouldn't last. You'd speak out of turn, or laugh too loudly, or accidentally step over a threshold with your left foot instead of your right. You'd forget to bow. You'd ask a question. You want to change something. And that alone would mark you as a threat to the order. But that's the brilliance among the tragedy in a feudal Japan. It wasn't made to be easy. It was made to endure. In an age where women were barely allowed to speak in public, let alone command an army, Artemisia of Korea existed like a historical glitch, someone who absolutely, by all the rules of ancient society, should not have been possible. And yet there she was, seated on a throne, wearing the double burden of queen and naval commander. Plotting war alongside some of the most powerful men of the ancient world, Artemisia ruled Halicarnassus, a city nestled along the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Technically a vassal under the sprawling Persian Empire, Halicarnassus was part of a patchwork of territories often caught in the gravitational pull of regional powers. But Artemisia didn't simply inherit a political position. She made it dangerous. She was Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, and a woman by biology, each identity carrying immense weight in an age dominated by iron and testosterone. Her father was likely of Carian descent, while her mother hailed from the island of Crete. Upon her husband's death, instead of stepping aside for a male successor, Artemisia claimed the reins of power. That was already an act of quiet defiance, but she didn't stop at ruling. She wanted to conquer. When Xerxes the Great launched his legendary invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia did something no other woman of her time dared. She volunteered for war, not to stitch bandages or offer prayers from a safe distance, but to command ships and risk death. She supplied 5 of her own vessels, sleek, fast, deadly, and led them personally into the thick of battle and Xerxes. The ruler of an empire stretching from India to Egypt didn't just tolerate her presence. He listened to her, valued her. It was a bold move. Some would say foolish. A Greek fighting for Persia. Treasonous. A woman on a warship. Unthinkable. But Artemisia knew what she was doing. She wasn't motivated by loyalty to bloodlines or empires. She was playing the game of survival and power. And she played it better than most of the men around her. In a world carved up by men with swords, Artemisia didn't ask for permission. She built her fleet, sailed into history, and dared anyone to stop her. By siding with Xerxes, Artemisia effectively declared war on her own people, the Greeks. It was a decision that raised eyebrows even before a single oar hit the water. And it wasn't just the usual whispers of treachery. This was personal. To the Greeks, she was a traitor in fine robes, a queen turned mercenary, a woman who had traded heritage for favor at a foreign king's table. But Artemisia didn't seem the least bit bothered. In fact, she doubled down. She sailed into the campaign like she belonged at the high table of Persian power, and in many ways she did. Xerxes, famous for surrounding himself with brutal warriors and sycophants, found in Artemisia something he rarely encountered: honesty. Blunt, piercing honesty. She told him not what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to know. In council meetings, surrounded by decorated generals and satraps with bloody boots, Artemisia spoke with clarity and strategy, and she was rarely wrong. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and often laced with warnings others were too proud to voice before the infamous Battle of Salamis. She urged Xerxes to avoid direct naval confrontation with the Greeks, warning that the cramped straits would nullify Persia's numerical advantage. But Xerxes, swayed by overconfidence and flattery, ignored her. That decision would come back to haunt him. Even among her Persian allies, Artemisia's presence was complicated. Many commanders resented her authority. After all, she wasn't just a woman, she was a Greek woman. one who told truth to power and led her own ships with unnerving precision. She wasn't there as a figurehead or symbolic mascot. She was there to win, and that unsettled more than a few mustachioed warlords who'd spent their lives in the business of conquest. Meanwhile, back in Greece, her name spread like a stain. Herodotus, himself from Halicarnassus, seemed both fascinated and baffled by her. He documented her with a mix of awe and suspicion, usually reserved for mythical creatures. To some, she was Medusa in a breastplate. To others, a misunderstood genius with the audacity to think like a man, and better than most of them. Artemisia was many things: loyalist, strategist, traitor, visionary. But above all, she was a political animal who understood one hard truth. In war, identity bends. Only power remains. If there was ever a stage that tested Artemisia's brilliance and boldness, it was the Battle of Salamis. This wasn't just any battle. It was the naval showdown of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian fleet, massive and overconfident, squared off against a much smaller but strategically positioned Greek navy in the narrow straits near Athens. It was here that Xerxes' campaign would falter, and it was here that Artemisia would make one of the most shocking tactical moves of her career. Let's rewind slightly. Artemisia had warned Xerxes not to engage the Greeks in these narrow waters. She argued correctly that their superior maneuverability and familiarity with the terrain would nullify the Persian size advantage. But Xerxes, intoxicated by numbers and pride, dismissed her warning. He wanted a spectacular victory. What he got instead was humiliation. As the battle raged, chaos swallowed the Persian lines. Ships collided, formations broke, and Greek triremes darted like sharks between lumbering vessels. It was a slaughter, and in the middle of it all was Artemisia, commanding her flagship, surrounded by allies and enemies, trying to survive a collapsing battle. Here's where things get wild. With a Greek ship pursuing her relentlessly, Artemisia made a decision that historians still debate today. She ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel, one from an allied king no less. The move was so unexpected that the Greeks, assuming she must be on her side, stopped chasing her. She slipped away untouched. Seas, watching from a hilltop, supposedly witnessed this and turned to his aides, exclaiming, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was perhaps the highest praise he ever gave a subordinate, especially one who had just sacrificed a friendly ship to save herself. But Artemisia's move wasn't just about survival. It was strategy, misdirection, and cold-blooded calculation wrapped into one. She read the battlefield in real time and made a split-second decision that saved her ship, her crew, and possibly her own life. It was controversial. It was brutal. But it worked. While many Persian commanders died that day or fell into disgrace, Artemisia sailed back not as a failure, but as one of the only leaders Xerxes still trusted. The Persian fleet limped back from Salamis, humiliated. Ships were lost, morale shattered. And the myth of Persian naval invincibility was obliterated. For many commanders, this was the beginning of the end. But for Artemisia, it was a strange kind of triumph. In the middle of a disastrous campaign, she emerged as the lone figure of competence, someone who had warned the king, acted decisively, and escaped unscathed. Xerxes took notice. Now back on land, licking the wounds of defeat, the Persian war machine had to pivot. And in a rare moment of candid trust, Xerxes turned once again to Artemisia, not as a novelty, but as his most reliable advisor. He asked her a deeply personal question. What should he do next? Artemisia, ever blunt, told him exactly what no proud emperor wanted to hear: retreat. She urged him to return to Persia and leave his trusted general Mardonius in charge of the remaining campaign in Greece. You've achieved what you needed. Athens has burned. Don't push your luck. That was essentially her message. And incredibly, Xerxes listened. The man who had ignored most of his war counsel followed the advice of a single woman. It was a moment that confirmed what others had only suspected. Artemisia wasn't just brave. She was politically lethal. She knew when to fight, when to deceive, and now when to walk away. Her power didn't come from brute force. It came from clarity, something in short supply among kings and conquerors. In the aftermath, she was entrusted with the guardianship of Xerxes' sons, an honor that spoke volumes. In ancient courts, you didn't hand your heirs to just anyone. You chose someone whose loyalty was ironclad and whose judgment could be trusted. Artemisia, a woman born on the fringes of the empire, had now placed herself right at its heart. Back in Halicarnassus, she returned not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as a figure of undeniable consequence. Her legend began to take root. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was the woman who stood face to face with empires and didn't blink. Where most would have sought safety in silence, Artemisia had stepped into war and somehow came back more powerful than when she left. While Artemisia's military feats gained her notoriety, her legacy didn't grow alone on the battlefield. It also thrived in the minds of those who recorded it, especially in the pen of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who just so happened to be born in Halicarnassus, the very city Artemisia ruled. This geographic coincidence added an almost eerie intimacy to his account of her life. He wasn't writing about some distant myth. He was writing about his queen, and yet Herodotus didn't present her as a caricature of feminine virtue or villainy. He painted her as something much rarer in historical record, a competent, calculating, and compelling leader. His account of the Battle of Salamis highlights not only her courage, but her cold pragmatism, the sinking of the Allied ship, the escape under Greek confusion, the brutal brilliance of it all in Herodotus's work. Artemisia becomes more than a commander. She becomes a contradiction, both admired and feared, respected and suspected. But make no mistake, that respect was hard-earned. She existed in the shadow of men, powerful ones like Xerxes and Mardonius, but somehow she outshone them all. While they drowned in ambition, she floated on foresight. She knew when to fight and when to vanish. That kind of wisdom is rare. Rarer still when it comes from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility. And perhaps that's what intrigued Herodotus the most. Artemisia didn't fit. Not in the cultural mold of her time, and certainly not in the comfortable categories historians like to build. She wasn't a rebel, but she disobeyed. She wasn't a feminist because the concept didn't exist, but she undermined patriarchy through competence alone. Her legacy spread quietly, not through monuments or golden statues, but through stories, echoes passed along by men who were forced to admit she was better than them. In war councils, she outthought them. In battle, she outmaneuvered them. And in politics, she outlasted them. For all their noise, the men of her time ended up needing scribes to keep their memory alive. Artemisia had something better. And as Herodotus put down his scroll and dipped his pen again, he wasn't just writing history. He was recording a riddle in the shape of a queen. Strangely enough, the name Artemisia didn't vanish after her death. About a century later, it returned, this time in the form of another queen, Artemisia the Sisiu of Curia, a namesake and likely descendant who also ruled Halicarnassus. But while the second Artemisia never commanded fleets in battle, she too would carve her name into the bones of history. Quite literally. Her claim to fame, building one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. The second Artemisia commissioned this towering marble tomb for her husband Mausolus, who was also her brother, because ancient dynastic politics never failed to get awkward. But it wasn't just a tribute to grief, it was a statement, a monument to Carian identity, and an echo of the strength that the first Artemisia had once wielded. Historians have long debated whether the two women were directly related. Mother and daughter, aunt and niece are possibly not related at all. But one thing is clear. The name Artemisia had by then become synonymous with power, intellect, and bold rule. The legacy of the original queen had seeped so deeply into the identity of Halicarnassus that future generations wore it like armor. Even more fascinating is how the later Artemisia's mausoleum gave us the very word we use today for monumental tombs. Mausoleum, a linguistic legacy born from stone, grief, and political theater. And while the second Artemisia was known for mourning, she was also a capable ruler, continuing the thread of female leadership in a corner of the ancient world where that was anything but normal. But let's not forget, the foundation for all of this was laid by the first Artemisia, the naval commander, the queen who advised Xerxes, the woman who navigated the Greek world as both insider and outsider. Without her, the name might have faded. Halicarnassus might have been just another forgotten city on a forgotten coast. Instead, it became a beacon, a place where two powerful women shaped history, not through accident, but through audacity. Their stories, though separated by time, speak to each other across the centuries. One with ships, one with stone, and both with names history could not quite bury. Artemisia's story has always lived in the in-between, between empires, between genders, between legend and history. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the way her legacy has been argued bent and reinterpreted over the centuries. Was she a Persian puppet, the Greek traitor, or simply a sovereign playing chess, while others were busy swinging swords? To Persians, she was a loyal commander, one of the few who gave sound advice and fought with distinction. Xerxes clearly trusted her more than many of his seasoned generals. That in itself speaks volumes about her political sharpness and composure under pressure in the Persian world. Her loyalty was seen as honorable, perhaps even heroic. To the Greeks, it was more complicated. Many viewed her as a turncoat, someone who had betrayed her Hellenic roots to side with an Eastern despot. And yet even Greek chroniclers, notably Herodotus, couldn't help but admire her intelligence and cunning. She was in many ways a mirror to their own contradictions, proving that not all Greeks stood with Greece, and not all Persians were villains. She defied the lines that war tried to draw. And then there's the modern view, where historians and readers alike continue to wrestle with what she represents. A feminist icon before feminism? Maybe. A symbol of shrewd leadership in a world built to exclude her? Absolutely. Her legacy continues to fascinate, not because she fit the mold of ancient queens, but because she cracked it open. In military circles, she is still cited in naval histories, often as a rare case of a woman commanding warships in antiquity. In literary and political circles, she appears as a symbol of reason in an age of hubris. And in popular culture, she occasionally resurfaces, sometimes twisted, sometimes glamorized, but always unmistakable. But here's the truth. Artemisia didn't care about legacy, not in the way we do. She wasn't building a brand or writing memoirs. She was trying to survive, to rule, to win. And that's what makes her story so enduring. It wasn't shaped by vanity or myth-making. It was shaped by decisions, hard ones, controversial ones, and more often than not the right ones. She didn't belong to Persia. She didn't belong to Greece. She belonged to herself as the centuries passed. Artemisia's story did what all great stories eventually do. It mutated. She was no longer just a historical figure. She became a myth, a metaphor, and sometimes a monster. Writers and dramatists reinvented her as they pleased. In some tales, she was a cruel seductress. In others, a warrior queen possessed by bloodlust. The real Artemisia, the tactician, the realist, the survivor, was buried under layers of fantasy and fear. Part of this distortion came from a simple truth. Men didn't know what to make of her. A woman who gave orders, who didn't crumble in the face of war, who told kings they were wrong and proved it. That didn't sit well with the ancient world. So storytellers did what they often do when faced with a woman they can't control. They rewrote her. One bizarre legend claimed that she fell hopelessly in love with a man who didn't return her affections, and in a fit of despair, she threw herself from a cliff. Not exactly the kind of thing a steely naval commander does, but it served the narrative of turning strength into tragedy. Another version painted her as a venomous schemer, more witch than queen. It's a pattern that repeats across history when a woman gains power through intellect or audacity. Later generations either soften her into a damsel or darken her into a villain. Artemisia got both treatments, neither of which honor the truth. The real Artemisia didn't rule with seduction or superstition. She ruled with vision, reason, and cold strategic brilliance. She played a man's game by her own rules and won. That, more than anything, terrified those who came after her. Because if one woman could do it, what was to stop others? Even in modern times, adaptations continue to distort her. Hollywood, for example, recast her as a vengeance-fueled femme fatale in 300. Rise of an Empire. Entertaining? Sure. Accurate? Absolutely not. But the fact that she still draws attention, still demands reinvention, proves one thing. Her legacy has teeth. The woman they feared didn't die. She evolved into myth, into memory, and into the long, uncomfortable question history keeps asking. What if more women had been like Artemisia? When Artemisia of Korea vanished from the records, she didn't vanish from history. She simply shifted form. Like the wake left behind a warship, her legacy rippled outward long after she sailed her final voyage. No grand tomb marks her resting place. No statues survive bearing her likeness, and yet her presence endures, etched into the bones of Halicarnassus, whispered in the pages of ancient chronicles, and debated in the halls of every historian trying to understand how she pulled off the impossible. Because Artemisia's life was exactly that, impossible. She ruled when women weren't supposed to rule, fought in wars where women weren't supposed to fight, gave advice where women weren't supposed to speak. And still, somehow she was heard. She wasn't merely tolerated, she was respected. That is perhaps her rarest achievement, not just surviving the ancient world as a woman in power, but earning the kind of grudging admiration that made even her enemies pause. Centuries later, her name remains a paradox, simultaneously exalted and obscured. She's not the household name that Cleopatra or Joan of Arc became, but perhaps that's fitting. Artemisia didn't chase legend. She chased outcomes. She wasn't adorned with mythic beauty or tragic romance. She was a leader, a realist, a strategist. Her drama played out not in poetry, but in the silence of war rooms, in the tight quarters of a ship, and in the long stare of a king who chose to listen. Today, her story invites re-examination, not just as a tale of a woman in a man's world, but as a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a crown or raise a sword. Sometimes it sits at the edge of power, says the uncomfortable thing, and sails straight into chaos. Artemisia didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be rewritten. What she needed, what she still deserves, is to be remembered as she was. Sharp, dangerous, brilliant. In an empire built by men, she charted her own course. Across hostile seas, against cultural gravity, and through the fog of war. And as long as ships sail and history remembers those who dare to speak when silence is safer, Artemisia of Korea will never be truly gone. Before lenses and satellites, before Copernicus dared rearrange the cosmos, humanity had only two tools for unlocking the secrets of the sky, the naked eye and stone. And somehow that was enough. Across the ancient world, civilizations looked up not just in wonder, but with intent. The stars were not mere decoration. They were calendars, compasses, gods, and prophecies. And so began the oldest science of all, astronomy. Long before it had a name, it was a necessity. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Sailors needed to know how to steer. Priests needed to know when to perform the right ritual at the right celestial moment. And astronomers, often indistinguishable from priests, kings, or mathematicians, were the ones everyone relied on. But without telescopes, how did they do it? They built temples not just for worship, but for watching. Massive structures like Stonehenge in England, Nabta Playa in Egypt, and the Great Pyramids of Mesoamerica weren't just tombs or altars. They were observatories carefully aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Many were designed to capture specific light patterns on solstices and equinoxes, sacred architecture with astronomical purpose. The great temple of Amoni-Asare at Karnak in Egypt, for example, was oriented so that the sun would rise precisely between its pylons on the summer solstice. The Maya at Chichen Itza built El Castillo, a pyramid that casts a shadow of a serpent slithering down its staircase on the spring and autumn equinoxes. In India, vast stone instruments like the Jantar Mantar allowed astronomers to track the declination of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. These weren't accidents. These weren't crude guesses. These were deliberate, data-driven feats of cosmic engineering, and they weren't isolated from the Andes to the Nile, from Babylon to Beijing. Humans were building with the stars in mind, sinking stone with starlight. They charted planetary motions, eclipses, and even retrograde movement with nothing but patience, observation, and a deep sense of cosmic order. The sky wasn't just watched. It was measured, mapped, and built into the very bones of their cities. Long before glass could magnify the heavens, civilizations were already recording their rhythm in stone. In silence and with astonishing accuracy, in the sun-baked floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians looked up and saw not just stars, but structure. Around 3000 BCE, they weren't simply telling stories about the heavens, they were organizing life around them. To the Sumerians, the sky wasn't random, it was a cosmic schedule, and their job was to interpret it correctly. These early astronomers laid the groundwork for what we now call celestial mechanics. They observed the regular motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and realized these movements weren't chaos. They were clocks. That's how they developed one of the earliest known calendars, dividing the year based on the lunar cycle. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably effective for tracking agricultural and ritual events. And speaking of time, the Sumerians gave us the sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting method still baked into how we measure minutes, seconds, and degrees. When you glance at a clock showing 60 minutes in an hour or 360 degrees in a circle, you're echoing a 5,000-year-old way of thinking. They didn't have telescopes, but they had ziggurats, stepped towers rising toward the heavens. From these platforms, priest astronomers kept careful records on clay tablets, noting when Venus appeared on the horizon, when the moon turned red during an eclipse, or when a star cluster returned after months below the horizon. Their word for these watchers? Amanu. Learned ones, both scientists and spiritual guides. Over time, Sumerian stargazing would evolve into something more systematic. Their descendants, the Babylonians, built vast star catalogs, predicted eclipses with eerie accuracy, and gave names to constellations that are still in use today. But it all began with the Sumerians scribbling celestial movements in cuneiform and laying down the earliest astronomical records we've ever found. Perhaps most impressive is how this early science blended seamlessly with mythology. To them, the sky was divine, yet predictable. The gods moved in patterns, and if you understood those patterns, you could align your crops, your rituals, and your fate. The Sumerians didn't just look up in awe. They looked up and began to measure, and in doing so, they started humanity's long relationship with the stars. If the Sumerians lit the first fire of astronomy, the Babylonians poured oil on it and turned it into an inferno of precision. By the time their empire flourished around 1800 BCE, Babylonian astronomers weren't just watching the skies, they were predicting them. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, retrograde motion, all charted, logged, and projected with stunning regularity. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. The Babylonians took the Sumerians' observational legacy and supercharged it with math. They recorded the positions of stars, planets, and the moon on clay tablets known today as the Enuma Anu, Enlil, and the Mulopin, some of the oldest known astronomical texts in existence. These weren't bedtime stories. They were raw data, line after line of celestial movements. When Venus would rise, how long it would shine, when a solar eclipse might strike. These tablets were essentially the world's first almanacs. The most remarkable part, they could predict lunar eclipses using a pattern known as the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat. They didn't understand why it worked, but they knew it did work, and that was enough. For a culture that fused divination with astronomy, being able to foresee cosmic events gave them enormous power, both spiritual and political. And while the Greeks are often credited with inventing the zodiac, the truth is the Babylonians got there first. They divided the sky into 12 equal parts, each anchored to a constellation, and laid the foundation for what would become the zodiac signs we still use and misuse today. Yes, when someone asks for your signature, you can thank Babylon. But what really sets the Babylonians apart is their mathematical boldness. They tracked planetary motion, even retrograde paths, and used arithmetic methods to approximate celestial cycles. Not geometric models, mind you. That would come later with the Greeks, but arithmetic worked. And for practical purposes, that was more than enough. They saw the universe as a ledger of patterns, a giant machine of repeating cycles. And their astronomers were not just mystics or priests. They were early scientists, hunched over tablets, decoding the rhythms of the cosmos in symbols and numbers. In the dark, they wrote the sky. While the Babylonians were busy predicting eclipses, the ancient Egyptians were syncing their entire civilization to the stars, quite literally. In the Nile Valley, astronomy wasn't just a curiosity, it was survival. In the heart of it all was a single star, Sirius, the brightest light in the night sky. The Egyptians noticed something extraordinary each year. Just before the annual flooding of the Nile, Sirius would reappear on the horizon during dawn. This event, known as the Heliacal Rising of Sirius, became the cornerstone of their calendar. That wasn't just poetic, it was vital. The Nile's floodwaters determined crop cycles, and missing that window could mean famine. So the Egyptians created a 365-day solar calendar divided into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days. It was remarkably close to our modern calendar, centuries before Julius Caesar ever got involved. But the Egyptians didn't stop with Sirius. They tracked the sun, moon, and stars from their temples, many of which were aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. The Temple of Karnak, for instance, was oriented so the sun would rise directly through its axis during the summer solstice. Other temples lined up with the rising and setting of stars considered sacred. And then there were the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2560 BCE, was aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its shafts may have been pointed toward specific stars, possibly Orion and Sirius, hinting at a celestial connection between the heavens and the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. This wasn't just burial architecture, it was cosmological engineering. Egyptian priests often served double duty as astronomers. They observed the skies not only for ritual timing, but for signs, omens, and the will of the gods. Astronomy, theology, and governance were tightly interwoven. To rule Egypt was to understand the sky. What's remarkable is that without telescopes, without even lenses, they developed an entire system for tracking time, orienting buildings, and forecasting natural events, all based on patient observation and relentless precision. The Egyptians didn't look at the sky for entertainment. They looked up and saw a divine clock ticking with purpose, echoing eternity. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, long before Europeans set foot in the New World, the Maya were building one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems the world had ever seen without metal tools. Without wheels and without telescopes, they mapped the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with a precision that still baffles modern scholars. To the Maya, astronomy was not a luxury of the learned elite. It was the framework of society itself. Their rulers were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and every major political or religious event was timed to match a celestial counterpart. Eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and Venus cycles weren't just observed, they were used to legitimize power. One of their most striking achievements was their tracking of Venus. The Maya noted that Venus disappeared and reappeared in the sky in a repeating cycle of 584 days, and they tied this rhythm into their ritual warfare and calendar systems. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian manuscripts, contains a Venus table that tracks the planet's movements over hundreds of years. With an error of less than 1 day, they didn't stop there. The Maya developed a complex long-count calendar capable of tracking dates over spans of thousands of years. They understood the solar year with incredible accuracy, about 365,420 days, remarkably close to the modern value. Their calendar systems were so refined that multiple ones ran simultaneously. The 260-day ritual calendar, Tzolk'in, the 365-day solar calendar Harp, and the long count for historical chronology and the observatories. They didn't have glass domes, but they had stone genders. The El Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza was built with specific windows and alignments that allowed Mayan priests to track the movements of Venus and the sun. Temple staircases and shadow effects were timed to equinoxes. Like the famous serpent shadow that slithers down El Castillo during the spring and autumn, the Maya weren't just watching the skies. They were synchronizing their civilization with them. Their kings ruled by the stars, their temples rose in tune with solstices, and their wars were timed with the wanderings of Venus. They didn't just read the cosmos, they wove it into the fabric of life. In ancient China, astronomy wasn't simply a science. It was a matter of state. The emperor, regarded as the son of heaven, ruled with the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement that could be revoked if the stars sent the wrong message. That made astronomy both sacred and political. If the sky changed, so could the dynasty. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were tracking celestial events and documenting them with methodical care. They recorded comets, novae, eclipses, sunspots, and planetary motions. Some of these records, like those found in the Shurji records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han, are still referenced by modern scientists today to verify ancient astronomical phenomena. Perhaps most remarkable is their documentation of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE, visible in daylight for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded its location with such accuracy. Modern astronomers used the data to identify the remnants, now known as the Crab Nebula. But China's astronomical prowess didn't rely on mystical interpretation alone. They developed mechanical devices such as armillary spheres and gnomons, shadow casting rods to measure the altitude of the sun and the positions of stars. In fact, the Chinese had working water-powered celestial globes and astronomical clocks centuries before Europe caught up. Chinese astronomers divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, similar in concept to Western constellations, and used them for both navigation and timekeeping. They also created the Chinese lunisolar calendar, which balanced lunar months with the solar year and remains in use today to determine traditional holidays like the Lunar New Year. One of their key contributions was a meticulous recording of eclipses. They not only predicted solar and lunar eclipses, but sometimes tied them to dynastic omens. If an eclipse occurred and the emperor hadn't been forewarned, it was considered a failure of the astronomers and sometimes a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. In short, astronomy in China wasn't tucked away in a scholar's study. It stood at the very core of governance, divinity, and national survival. The stars didn't just tell time, they told the truth, and the empire listened. In ancient India, astronomy was never a separate discipline. It was interwoven with philosophy, ritual, mathematics, and metaphysics. Known as Jyotisha, the science of light, Indian astronomy began as a tool for determining auspicious timings for rituals, but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced systems of celestial observation in the ancient world. The earliest references to celestial events appear in the Vedas, composed around 1500 BCE. These sacred texts mention the sun, moon, and planetary cycles, as well as the division of the sky into 27 nakshatras, lunar mansions that formed the core of early Indian sky mapping. These nakshatras were tied to both mythology and calculation, forming the basis of astrological charts and calendars still used in India today. But Indian astronomy wasn't just poetic, it was shockingly precise. Ancient scholars developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar introduced much later by the Romans. The Surya Siddhanta, a foundational astronomical text compiled around 500 CE based on earlier knowledge, describes the Earth's axial tilt, the elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity centuries before Newton. Perhaps the most revolutionary figure in Indian astronomy was Aryabhata, who in 499 CE proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis daily, a theory rarely entertained in other parts of the world at that time. He also calculated the length of the solar year at 365.358 days, just a tiny fraction off from modern values, and developed advanced trigonometric functions to assist in astronomical calculations. Indian astronomers also created sophisticated sine tables, worked with decimal notation, and used shadow instruments and armillary spheres to measure angles and altitudes. Observatories were often aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. But beyond technical achievements, Indian astronomy carried a cosmic elegance. The universe wasn't just a machine, it was a cycle, a dance of time and space unfolding endlessly. Astronomy wasn't about domination over nature, it was about harmony with it. In the Indian worldview, understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the self, a geometry of spirit where planets moved not just across the sky, but through the soul. If other civilizations looked to the sky for guidance, ritual, or survival, the ancient Greeks looked up and asked why? Why do the stars move? Why do planets wander? And most importantly, can the cosmos be explained by reason? Greek astronomy marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the heavens. Where others saw patterns and portents, the Greeks sought laws. They weren't just observers, they were theorists trying to decode the sky using mathematics, geometry, and philosophy. It began with Thales of Miletus, one of the first to suggest that celestial phenomena had natural causes. Then came Anaximander, who imagined the Earth floating in space. unsupported, and suggested that the heavens formed a sphere. These ideas may sound crude today, but for their time they were revolutionary. The true leap came with Pythagoras, who viewed the cosmos as a system of perfect harmony, a music of the spheres governed by mathematical ratios. His followers believed the universe could be understood through numbers, laying the foundation for theoretical astronomy. But it was Aristarchus of Samos who came closest to modern truth. In the 3rd century BCE, he proposed a heliocentric model, with the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe. His ideas were ignored for nearly 2,000 years, but they planted a seed that would later bloom with Copernicus. Then came Hipparchus, the father of observational astronomy. He created the first star catalog, divided stars by brightness, and discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and developed trigonometric tools to calculate celestial positions. His accuracy was astonishing, especially without telescopes. And finally, there was Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almagest became the authoritative astronomical text for over a millennium. He synthesized Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian knowledge into a geocentric model that explained planetary motion using epicycles and deference, a complex yet elegant system. That worked until it didn't. While some Greek ideas were wrong, their commitment to rational explanation and systematic modeling changed the game. They taught the world that the stars weren't random. They were governed by patterns that the human mind could understand. With the Greeks, astronomy became more than observation. It became an argument between earth and sky, between logic and myth, and between what we see and what we know. By the time the telescope was invented in the early 17th century, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the skies with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And yet, what those ancient civilizations achieved is nothing short of astonishing. They mapped stars, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, and built monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes, all without lenses, satellites, or electricity. What makes their accomplishments even more extraordinary is that they did it independently. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Maya in Mesoamerica, the Chinese and Indians in Asia, the Greeks and Egyptians around the Mediterranean. They all developed astronomical systems rooted in their own worldviews. Yet despite being oceans apart, they arrived at similar conclusions. The heavens move with order, and that order matters. Ancient astronomy wasn't confined to ivory towers. It shaped agriculture, religion, architecture, politics, and philosophy. It dictated when to plant, when to pray, when to build, and when to rule. In every culture, understanding the sky was seen as a way of understanding the divine, or at the very least, one's place in the vast machinery of existence. And while their models varied, some geocentric, some mythological, some cyclical, they all shared one trait: a deep, unwavering respect for the cosmos. For many ancient peoples, the sky wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive, deliberate, and sacred. The telescope would eventually change everything. It revealed moons circling Jupiter, phases of Venus, sunspots, and galaxies far beyond our own. But the groundwork, the patient mapping, the systematic records, the sheer curiosity that belonged to the ancients. Today we carry their legacy every time we check a calendar, map the stars with a phone app, or celebrate a solstice. Every GPS satellite and space mission is built on a foundation they laid in clay, stone, and papyrus. They didn't know about black holes or cosmic microwave backgrounds, but they asked the right questions. They looked up and they noticed in the darkness without knowing it. They became the first scientists. Quietly, faithfully, they wrote their questions in the sky. And thanks to them, we now have the tools to look deeper, not just into space, but into our own origins. In 1803, something unprecedented happened. A young republic, barely 3 decades old, bought a landmass so vast it doubled its territory overnight. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a real estate deal, it was a geopolitical thunderclap. With the stroke of a pen, the United States acquired more than 828,000 square miles of land from France, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. 13 future states would eventually rise from this vast, fertile terrain. And the price? A cool $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. But what makes this even more extraordinary is that no one, not even the Americans, saw it coming. At the time, President Thomas Jefferson had one goal: to secure access to the Mississippi River and the crucial port city of New Orleans. The young nation was heavily dependent on river trade. Farmers in the Ohio Valley needed to float their goods south, and whoever controlled New Orleans held the keys to economic survival. Jefferson authorized diplomats to offer France up to $10 million just for New Orleans and some nearby lands. That's it. But when those diplomats arrived, they were blindsided. The French had a counteroffer. Not just New Orleans, the entire Louisiana territory. Why? France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, was shifting its priorities. Napoleon had dreams of a grand North American empire, but the Haitian Revolution had crushed French ambitions in the Caribbean. Disease, rebellion, and mounting tensions with Britain made holding on to Louisiana more trouble than it was worth. Napoleon needed money for war, not swamps and prairie. Faced with an unexpected opportunity, the American negotiators said yes quickly, even before they could get full approval from Jefferson. After all, this wasn't just a port. It was the Mississippi River, the Great Plains, access to the Rocky Mountains, and future control over the heart of the continent. What Jefferson received, it wasn't just land, it was destiny. A blank canvas for westward expansion, national growth, and inevitably conflict. But while newspapers celebrated, one truth was ignored. This land was not empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations, each with their own histories, alliances, and claims. And so a deal made in Paris would not only reshape maps, it would alter lives across an entire continent. At the heart of the Louisiana Purchase stood one man with a crown and a headache: Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1803, the French emperor was fighting on too many fronts in Europe, in the Caribbean, and in his own treasury. And so, in an act that shocked nearly everyone involved, he offered to sell off a third of North America to the very country he had once hoped to block from continental power. It hadn't started that way. Just a few years earlier, France had secretly acquired Louisiana from Spain under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Napoleon had grand dreams of restoring a French colonial empire. Louisiana would feed Saint-Domingue, the crown jewel of France's Caribbean colonies, today known as Haiti, with wheat, meat, and supplies. France didn't want Louisiana for its own sake. It wanted it to support sugar. But that vision collapsed in fire and fever. The Haitian Revolution, led by formerly enslaved people under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, had erupted into full rebellion. France sent tens of thousands of troops to crush it and watch them die by the thousands, not just from battle, but from yellow fever. Napoleon lost his best general, his army, and his chance to reclaim the richest sugar colony on earth. With Saint-Domingue slipping away, Louisiana became irrelevant, worse than irrelevant. It was now indefensible. And with Britain preparing for another war against France, Napoleon feared Louisiana might be taken by force. So instead of fighting to keep it, he sold it. And in typical Napoleon fashion, the decision was fast, bold, and entirely pragmatic. On April 11, 1803, he stunned American diplomats Robert Livingstone and James Monroe with an offer: all of Louisiana, not just New Orleans, for $15 million. Napoleon's reasoning was simple. I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. He didn't just want money. He wanted the U.S. to grow strong enough to stand against Britain. Selling Louisiana didn't surrender. It was a strategy. And so, in a single act, Napoleon abandoned his American empire and changed the future of a country he barely respected. What was an imperial afterthought to him would become the launching pad for America's expansion west, and the beginning of the end for native sovereignty across the continent. Thomas Jefferson had long envisioned an agrarian republic, a nation of independent farmers living on their own land, bound together by liberty and civic virtue. The Louisiana Purchase should have been his dream come true, but instead it gave him a constitutional nightmare. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. And guess what? Nowhere in that document did it say the U.S. government could buy foreign territory. There was no clause for purchasing a continent, no legal roadmap for doubling the size of the nation in one transaction. So, Jefferson hesitated. The offer for Napoleon was almost too good to be true. $15 million for land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It was a once-in-a-civilization opportunity, but Jefferson wrestled with the contradiction. Could he, a man who feared federal overreach, stretch the Constitution to justify such a massive acquisition? In private, he considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But the clock was ticking and political realities loomed. If he delayed, Napoleon might change his mind, or Britain might seize the territory before the ink could dry. So Jefferson did something ironic. He embraced implied powers, the very thing he had criticized Alexander Hamilton for advocating years earlier. He rationalized the purchase as a treaty, which the Constitution did allow the president to make with Senate approval. The Senate ratified the deal in October 1803 with overwhelming support, and Jefferson, while quietly uneasy, defended his decision as necessary for the survival and security of the Republic. And just like that, Jefferson, the constitutional purist, became the architect of the largest peaceful land acquisition in the U.S. history. The contradiction wasn't lost on his critics, who called him a hypocrite, but Jefferson saw it as a necessary compromise, bending the Constitution in his view to preserve the Republic rather than destroy it. In doing so, he set a precedent. The federal government could acquire land by treaty even without explicit constitutional authority, and that precedent would be invoked again and again as the United States expanded further west and into territories already lived on by others. The Louisiana Purchase had been signed, sealed, and ratified, but nobody really knew what the U.S. had just bought. The land was vast, sparsely mapped, and filled with unknown rivers, mountains, species, and people. So in 1804, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition. That would become one of the most iconic journeys in American history, the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was ambitious: to explore the new territory, establish trade with native nations, study the land's resources, and most importantly, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson dreamed of a Northwest Passage, a navigable link between the Atlantic and Pacific. That would revolutionize trade. Spoiler, it didn't exist. But what Lewis and Clark found would still transform how Americans saw their place on the continent. They started in St. Louis in May 1804 with a team of over 30 men and headed upriver into land untouched by American settlers. Along the way, they documented over 100 new animal species and 178 new plants. They mapped rivers, sketched mountains, and kept meticulous journals filled with scientific and ethnographic observations. But they didn't do it alone. One of the most essential figures on the journey was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the expedition with her French-Canadian husband. Sacagawea was not just a translator. She was a symbol of peace. Her presence with a child signaled to native tribes that this was not a war party. Her knowledge of geography and diplomacy helped the Corps survive dangerous crossings and build crucial alliances. Over 2 years, the expedition traveled more than 8,000 miles, all by boat, horse, and foot. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805, built a fort for the winter, and returned east by 1806. They didn't find a Northwest Passage, but they brought back something arguably more valuable: a detailed account of the newly acquired land and the people who lived there. Jefferson had purchased a mystery. Lewis and Clark began to make it real. But while their reports inspired dreams of westward expansion, they also foreshadowed something darker: the coming pressure on indigenous nations and the inevitable push toward conquest under the banner of discovery. To American politicians and settlers, the Louisiana Purchase was a land bonanza, a blank slate for farms, cities, and ambition. But to the native nations who had lived there for centuries, it was something else entirely: the beginning of erasure. The land the U.S. had purchased from France was already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with its own language, territory, and system of governance. From the Osage and Sioux to the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Mandan, these communities had been managing the land, trading with one another, and making alliances long before any European flag had been planted. But in the eyes of Jefferson and future U.S. leaders, the Louisiana Territory was a vast, underused, and ripe for American settlement. The native nations who lived there were not consulted in a deal. They weren't notified. They weren't compensated. One day they were sovereign peoples. Next, they were declared subjects of the expanding American Republic. Jefferson believed native people could either assimilate into American society or relocate peacefully if possible, but forcibly if necessary. In private letters, he wrote that as settlers moved indigenous people would have to move westward too, or perish. It wasn't yet called removal, but the idea was already forming. This pressure intensified. After the Lewis and Clark expedition returned with news of abundant land and natural wealth, the federal government began negotiating treaties, many of them deceptive or coercive, to claim land and push tribes farther. In some cases, military force backed these efforts. In others, it was disease and displacement that did the work. The Louisiana Purchase marked the start of a new phase in U.S. expansion, Manifest Destiny, before it had a name. The belief that the United States was meant to control the continent had its legal foundation in this sale, and its moral cost in the lives and lands of native nations. For indigenous peoples, the Louisiana Purchase was not a transaction. It was a trespass. It redrew maps that had never been theirs, erased boundaries that had never been acknowledged, and unleashed a wave of settlers who came not to trade, but to take. And that wave was only just beginning. The Louisiana Purchase was hailed as a triumph, a peaceful acquisition of territory that nearly doubled the size of the United States. But while the land deal was clean on paper, the reality on the ground was anything but. Expansion came with a price, paid not in gold, but in conflict, displacement, and cultural destruction. With the new territory secured, American settlers began flooding westward. Driven by hopes of fertile farmland, personal freedom, and economic opportunity, they pushed into lands still inhabited by indigenous nations. The federal government followed, establishing forts, roads, and administrative posts to manage and enforce its new authority. This set the stage for a slow-burning collision between two visions of the land, one that saw it as property to be claimed and improved, and another that saw it as a living entity to be shared and respected. Unsurprisingly, conflict erupted. Skirmishes turned into wars. Treaties were signed, then broken. And slowly, the frontier line moved further pushed by the force of rifles, railroads, and relentless ambition. But it wasn't just indigenous nations who paid a price. The Louisiana Territory also intensified a moral crisis that would eventually fracture the nation. Slavery. Southern leaders immediately saw the vast new lands as an opportunity to expand plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern parts of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as essential to making it profitable. This raised an explosive question. Would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The answer would haunt Congress for decades. It led to the Missouri Compromise, sectional tensions, and eventually the Civil War. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just stretch America's borders, it stretched its political fabric to the breaking point. And there were environmental consequences, too. The rivers were dammed, the plains plowed, the buffalo nearly wiped out. The transformation was rapid and irreversible. What had once been a landscape shaped by fire, herds, and indigenous stewardship became a patchwork of farms, fences, and industrial extraction. In seizing the land, the United States also inherited the burden of what it had done, a legacy that still echoes in debates over land rights, tribal sovereignty, and reparations. The land may have been purchased, but the real cost is still being paid. Once the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a new question emerged. How exactly do you govern a territory so vast it defied imagination? The land stretched over what will become all or part of 15 modern U.S. states, from Louisiana to Montana, and from the Dakotas to Colorado. But in 1803, it was an undefined wilderness, full of possibilities, but with few roads, no towns, and countless competing claims. The first step was surveying, mapping out borders, rivers, mountains, and eventually property lines. Expeditions like those led by Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, and others laid the groundwork. Cartographers, land speculators, and military engineers followed, drawing maps that would slowly become county lines, reservations, and state borders. What had been an open and interconnected indigenous world was now being chopped into rectangles. Congress passed laws to organize the territory, first as military districts, then as organized territories, each with governors appointed by the federal government. These new administrative units follow the pattern established by the Northwest Ordinance. Once a territory had enough settlers, it could apply for statehood. But not all borders were drawn with logic or justice. Take the creation of Missouri in 1821, the first state carved from the Purchase. Its admission triggered national uproar because Missouri wanted to allow slavery. The resulting Missouri Compromise drew an imaginary line across the Purchase. Slavery would be allowed south of it, banned to the north. That single line would haunt American politics for decades, as each new state's status threatened to tip the balance between North and South. Meanwhile, white settlers poured into the new territories, often ahead of the law. They claimed land through preemption, squatting, and increasingly through federally sponsored land grants. Native peoples, even those with existing treaties, found their lands suddenly reclassified, first as territory, then as open land, then as someone else's farm. And while maps were being filled in, they were also erasing native trails, erasing seasonal migrations, erasing indigenous names and replacing them with names like Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, and Fort Pierre borders in this new vision of America. Weren't just lines on a map. They were tools of control, ways to claim, divide, sell, and govern land that, just a few years earlier, had belonged to no president, no state, and certainly no empire. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just reshape America's borders, it redefined its identity. With one diplomatic stroke, the United States went from a coastal republic hugging the Atlantic to a continental power stretching toward the unknown. It was the first great leap of manifest destiny even before the term existed, and it set the tone for the next century of expansion, conquest, and reinvention. Politically, the Purchase established the precedent that the federal government could acquire new land through treaty, even without clear constitutional guidance. That precedent would be used again with Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. The U.S. became not just a country, but a collector of territory, a nation always looking westward. Culturally, it fed a new kind of American myth, that of the frontier. The Louisiana Territory became the backdrop for stories of rugged settlers, daring explorers, and wide-open possibilities. But for every pioneer's dream, there was a native nightmare, a memory of land lost, treaties broken, and people pushed further into exile economically. The impact was staggering. The Mississippi River became the artery of American commerce. Cities like St. Louis, New Orleans, and Kansas City grew into vital trade hubs. Fertile plains turned into farmland, and the discovery of gold, silver, and other natural resources would turn portions of the Purchase into engines of industrial growth. But the deeper legacy is a contradiction. The Purchase represented American ideals, opportunity, growth, independence. And yet it also embodied America's deepest failures: dispossession, slavery, imperial ambition. It's a story of triumph written on land taken from others, often violently. Today, the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase define states that millions call home. Highways crisscross where buffalo once roamed. Fields of wheat now grow where sacred grounds once stood. And yet, beneath the soil and asphalt, the memory of that Purchase still lingers, not just as a transaction, but as a turning point. The United States was forever changed by it. So was the world. But the question remains, was the cost purely monetary? Or was it, as many would later argue, measured in lives, cultures, and landscapes that can never be bought back in the end? The Louisiana Purchase was more than a land deal. It was a defining moment, a shift in American identity from a fragile republic clinging to the eastern seaboard to an empire in the making, stretching boldly into the interior. The ink dried in Paris, but the consequences echoed across prairies, rivers, and generations. For the United States, it meant possibility. It sparked a new national confidence, a belief that expansion was not only desirable, but inevitable. That belief would harden into policy, becoming manifest destiny, and would eventually drive the U.S. to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. It also cemented a model of power built on land acquisition, displacement, and development. The West was no longer a mystery, it was a target. And for settlers, speculators, and politicians, it was an open invitation to seize opportunity. By uprooting what already existed for native nations, the transformation was catastrophic. The land they had lived on, traded through, fought for, and honored was suddenly owned, not by an invading army, but by a distant government that claimed to have bought it. There were no negotiations, no consent, just a line on a map and a new set of rules. The arrival of American settlers accelerated cycles of violence, forced removals, and cultural devastation. Treaties came and went, reservations were drawn, bison were slaughtered, languages faded. By the time the dust settled, the native presence in the Louisiana Territory had been largely confined, silenced, or erased, though never extinguished. And yet, the legacy of the purchase remains layered. The cities, economies, and infrastructure that emerged from it helped shape the modern United States. The rivers it granted became lifelines. The natural resources it offered fueled industrial growth. The space it opened allowed for innovation, diversity, and reinvention. But the shadow of that deal still lingers. The Louisiana Purchase stands today as a paradox, a bold diplomatic victory, and a blueprint for displacement. It's a story of growth and grief, of ambition and amnesia. It made the United States what it is, but it also forced a reckoning that continues to this day. How do you celebrate a land you never truly asked for and can never truly return? It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim, mud-covered parade of monks, plagues, and potatoes. But under all that woe and despair, there were people, regular, flawed, experimental people who occasionally looked at a strange route and thought, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with hot wine. And to be fair, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants, and the local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read or wondering how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too, contrary to modern assumptions. The concept of using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or simply make one's day slightly less horrible wasn't rare. It was baked right into the culture. But it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind haystacks. It was wrapped in terms like visionary states, divine inspiration, pain relief, or in extreme cases, doctors used herbs. Monks grew them. Witches, depending on who you asked, applied them, and almost everyone encountered these substances in some form through medicine, ritual, or accidental consumption of moldy bread. Again, the range of medieval intoxicants wasn't limited to a tankard of warm ale, though that helped. They had roots that screamed, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that induced prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying naked through the sky with Satan's catering team. Getting high wasn't necessarily recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just very poor judgment on an empty stomach. And depending on your social rank, it might have been delivered by a barber, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who learned it from a very wise squirrel. In the medieval world, you didn't need a shady back alley or a velvet roped club to get your hands on mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Medieval Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, let's say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying levels of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of Russian roulette. Properly prepared, it eased pain and brought on sleep. Improperly prepared, it introduced you to an entirely new set of problems, like convulsions and a strong desire to remove your own shoes while running through the woods screaming. Or mandrake, the root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Legends said it screamed when pulled from the ground, a noise so lethal it could kill a man. That didn't stop people from digging it up anyway, usually by tying it to a dog and standing far away. Ingesting mandrake could induce unconsciousness, visions, and on a good day, prophetic dreams. On a bad day, well, you wouldn't be needing herbs anymore. Then there was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is exactly the kind of name that screams maybe not. It was used to dilate pupils for beauty, but also to treat pain, cause hallucinations, and, on occasion, death. Medieval self-care was a bold business. These herbs were often combined into teas, tinctures, oils, or those famous flying ointments we'll get to soon. And they weren't always consumed voluntarily. Sometimes they were applied during religious ceremonies, medical procedures, or by a well-meaning apothecary who thought a little extra root can't hurt, but hurt it could. Henbane, the medieval equivalent of let's see what this button does. Known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger, and to everyone else as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a staple of the Middle Ages unofficial pharmacy. Used across Europe for centuries, henbane wasn't just a casual plant, it was a mood. Monks recorded its properties in herbals. Physicians used it to dull pain. Witches used it to ride broomsticks through their imaginations. And peasants mostly hoped not to eat it by accident. So what exactly did henbane do? Well, that depends. In small doses, it acted as a sedative. It could ease toothaches, help with insomnia, and make childbirth slightly less traumatic. In other words, it was the medieval version of take two and try not to scream. But in larger doses, or just poorly timed ones, henbane could cause delirium, hallucinations, wild agitation, and in some cases a heartfelt conversation with a turnip you thought was your deceased grandmother. It contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. To put it non-scientifically, your medieval brain gets weird fast. Visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and spontaneous outbursts of interpretive dance were all on the menu. Henbane was often smoked, brewed into teas, or even combined with fat and smeared on the skin. A popular delivery method for anyone who didn't like their consciousness arranged in a linear fashion. Now, was it legal? Technically, yes. Controlled substances weren't a thing yet, but it was controversial, especially with the church. Anything that altered perception was suspicious. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, henbane had fans among healers, mystics, and people with nothing to lose. It even made its way into beer recipes before being banned in favor of safer additives like hops. Few plants in the medieval world were as feared, revered, and dramatically misunderstood as mandrake, a root so potent and weirdly human-shaped that it sparked a mix of botany, folklore, and sheer panic. Botanically known as Mandragora officinarum, the mandrake was associated with sleep, hallucinations, fertility, and a high probability of either mystical visions or waking up in a ditch next to a confused goat. Either way, something happened. Medieval herbalists believed that the root, which often resembled a stubby, contorted human figure, contained powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and according to some, conduit to prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine to calm pain, or you could inhale its fumes and immediately question all your life decisions. But the real fame of the mandrake came from its alleged habit of screaming when uprooted. Yes, screaming, as in don't pull me out of the dirt or you'll die from the noise kind of screaming. Medieval texts warned that simply hearing the mandrake's cry could kill a man, which naturally led to some creative harvesting techniques. The most famous involved tying the root to a dog, walking away, and letting the poor animal do the dirty work. The assumption was that the dog would die instead of you, a plan that raises some ethical red flags, even by medieval standards, once harvested and the dog properly mourned. The mandrake could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a charm. Some people even carried tiny mandrake figures in pouches to ward off evil or promote fertility. Because nothing says romance like a mummified root that sounds like it's seen things. The church, predictably, didn't love mandrakes. Anything that caused visions and wasn't tied to organized religion was treated as witchcraft adjacent. Still, monks recorded mandrake recipes in herbals with suspiciously detailed instructions. Used correctly, mandrake could dull pain before surgery, treat insomnia, and create trippy, vivid dreams. Used incorrectly, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or your family staging an exorcism because you thought your soup was whispering. Let's say you're a medieval noblewoman, hoping to attract attention at a feast. You could wear your best linen. You could braid flowers into your hair, or if you were really serious, you could drip literal poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as Atreupa belladonna, or more honestly, Deadly Nightshade. The name alone sounds like a final boss in a medieval RPG. And yes, it was both alluring and lethal, the botanical equivalent of a seductive but unstable ex. The name Belladonna means beautiful lady, because when a few drops of its extract were added to the eyes, it dilated the pupils. Wide eyes were considered attractive, mysterious, and maybe even a little saintly. Of course, the downside was blurry vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended poisoning. But hey, beauty standards have never been particularly forgiving. Cosmetics aside, Belladonna had other talents. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum. Though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling-dripping Latin prayers, the plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which mess with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to why is the wallpaper vibrating. It was a common ingredient in potions, flying ointments, and some very questionable medical procedures. Want to numb a patient before sawing off a limb? Belladonna. Want to simulate a death-like sleep for theatrical or suspicious purposes? Belladonna. Want to accidentally meet a few saints and possibly the devil in your dreams? You get the idea. And yet, despite its toxicity, Belladonna was part of the medieval medical toolkit. Physicians used it carefully or recklessly, depending on how bad the plague was that week, and it shows up in herbals, recipes, and love charms across Europe. Before modern edibles came in discreet packaging and fruity flavors, medieval folks were already getting inventive, just not with chocolate. Instead, they relied on ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Welcome to the world of medieval transdermal delivery systems, or in plain English, rubbing weird paste on your skin and hoping for the best. These concoctions weren't made for a casual weekend bus. Many were tied to rituals, folk medicine, and spiritual experiences. They could knock you out, send you into ecstatic trances, or, if misused, cause you to believe you were turning into a lizard. Application was often topical, which sounds safer, until you learn the preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Yes, those membranes. Cue the infamous flying ointments associated with witches, a lovely blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and pig fat, often applied to, let's just say, intimate areas. The goal? A euphoric sensation of flying. The result? Either a transcendent astral journey or waking up in a haystack with half your teeth and no memory of how you got there. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in wine, broth, or some liquid that smelled like regret. Apothecaries loved mixing poppy extract with spiced wine, a combo strong enough to numb you during surgery or give you a front row seat to a divine revelation you didn't ask for. And let's not forget the elixirs sold by wandering quacks. These traveling pharmacists promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague, often using recipes that could also dissolve a shoe. Did they work? Maybe. Or maybe they just made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The magic of these medieval edibles was that no one could quite predict the outcome. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or scream at the moon and swear eternal loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to find out. Let's talk about the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. It might seem quaint now, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes, but back then it came with an awkwardly scandalous backstory. Spoiler. The broomstick wasn't just for sweeping. The connection between witches and broomsticks actually has chemical roots. And no, not just mandrake. Historical records, especially those written by suspicious inquisitors, describe witches using flying ointments. Thick, trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and datura, all of which are about as friendly as a drunk porcupine. But here's the kicker. These ointments weren't taken by mouth. Why? Because the ingredients were toxic and stomachs are famously ungrateful. Instead, they were applied topically. And by topically, we mean mucous membranes. And by mucous membranes, we mean, yes, exactly what you're thinking. Hence the broomstick, or as some sources delicately phrased it, staff anointed for transportation. The handle was used as a vehicle for applying the ointment to areas with high absorption. Not exactly PG, but highly effective. Within minutes, users reported visions of flying through the night sky, attending feasts with the devil, or simply hovering above the village like the world's most confused drone. Of course, these were hallucinations, but in an age where medicine, magic, and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one questioned it much. Inquisitors and theologians took note, of course, not because they were interested in pharmacology, but because they saw flying as evidence of consorting with demons, which is ironic considering the hallucinations were chemically induced and deeply unreliable. But when has medieval justice ever needed evidence? While medieval Europe was busy applying poison to broomsticks and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east in the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Enter hashish, the plant-based answer to existential dread and camel traffic. Derived from cannabis resin, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics, and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests field testing. Hashish was often consumed orally, usually mixed with honey, spices, or other herbs, making it the first edible to actually taste good, as opposed to medieval Europe's tradition of bitter teas and things that smelled like spoiled socks. Its use wasn't just recreational, though yes, that absolutely happened. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners sought spiritual union with the divine. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation, or at the very least, encourage long, thoughtful stares at walls. In fact, many Sufi poets and philosophers spoke of hashish. The way modern songwriters speak about bad breakups with intense emotion, abstract metaphors, and just enough fog to make you wonder if they were okay. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers tried to ban hashish use periodically, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or people giggling too much during prayer. But like most substance bans in history, this had roughly the same success rate as teaching a cat to juggle. The legendary Hashishin, the original assassins, were even said to have used hashish before missions to get into the proper mindset for stabbing. That claim's mostly myth, but it's a great example of how cannabis-based products were already wrapped in both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, Europe was centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or calling it devil grass when you picture a medieval church. You might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chanting, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense wafting through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't just about holiness. It also had a little something extra psychoactive potential. Let's start with the two heavy hitters, frankincense and myrrh, both resinous substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Burned in churches, temples, and royal courts, they were meant to cleanse the air, ward off evil spirits, and make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and fish stew. But here's the twist. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, particularly incensyl acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sat in enough smoke. Gregorian chant wasn't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, which is to say all of them, prolonged exposure to incense could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially if paired with fasting, dehydration, or extreme boredom. It wasn't uncommon for monks or devotees to report visions during long services, and while they often credited divine inspiration, it's possible some were just lightly buzzed from resin fumes. And if you think this was limited to Christian spaces, think again. Incense was a common fixture in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and even pre-Christian pagan rites. It transcended religion. Everyone loves a good vibe, apparently. Clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality enough to make 5-hour sermons a bit more tolerable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lo-fi beats and lighting a scented candle, but with more Latin and less chill. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house and calling it medicine. And in a way, it was. Water wasn't exactly safe to drink. Most natural sources were either contaminated or casually downstream from livestock, which meant sipping from a stream was basically playing intestinal roulette. So instead, people reached for something a little more fermented. Enter small beer, the medieval version of LaCroix, but with alcohol and a much higher chance of being brewed by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients by intuition and prayer. This low-alcohol drink was consumed daily by adults and children alike. Not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a light buzz and regular hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier or simply had fewer plans for the day, you might opt for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. And yes, wine was often mixed with herbs or spices, either for flavor, medicinal effect, or just to see what happened. In monasteries, brewing beer was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste-tested the results, often with great enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were well ahead of the curve. But alcohol wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle enhancer. Want to dull the pain of medieval dentistry? No. Want to treat melancholy? Want to forget you live in a drafty hovel with 6 other people and one extremely judgmental chicken? Taverns, inns, and roadside alehouses served as medieval therapy. Offices, only with more yelling. People drank to celebrate, mourn, gossip, and occasionally invent entirely new dance styles no one asked for. Sometimes getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a decision. It was just breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it looked like a slightly weird, blackened kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval curse. Convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, and occasionally the sensation that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original LSD trip. Centuries before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything with tie-dye, people in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damp regions like France and the Germanic territories, frequently baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because of hunger trumps fungus awareness, and so entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves, and the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were 2 forms of ergotism. Yes, it had a name. Convulsive ergotism, characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and fits of laughter or panic. Gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs blackening, shriveling, and falling off. Not ideal for dinner parties. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behavior, including dancing plagues, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness. But in reality, it may have just been a mass case of unintentional mushroom toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, which ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat victims of ergotism, often by feeding them wheat-based diets instead of rye. So yes, the cure was different bread. Did people connect the dots? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or definitely possessed, and no one was testing for psychoactive alkaloids in their porridge. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Even today, some scholars believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials. Hallucinations, fits, paranoia, all very ergot-y. But that's still debated. What's not debated? Medieval Europe got high on toast and didn't even know it. You've heard of magic mushrooms. You've heard of flying ointments. But have you ever heard of mad honey? Yes, in a few special corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on it. This wasn't your average grocery store honey, mind you. We're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers, pretty pink blooms with a dark secret. They're laced with granitoxins, naturally occurring compounds that don't play nicely with the human nervous system. The result? Mad honey, a substance so potent it could bring on dizziness, hallucinations, vomiting, slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions, usually in that order. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera, starring your own eyebrows. This wasn't just a local curiosity, it was weaponized, according to ancient and medieval sources. Invading armies were once deliberately poisoned with mad honey left behind in abandoned villages. Soldiers thought they'd scored free snacks. Instead, they ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that puke is not to be trusted. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about these effects centuries earlier, but the use persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle the stuff, a little on bread for a headache, a little in wine for visions, or none at all if you actually wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Mad honey became known as a remedy and a recreational substance, especially in mystical or folk healing traditions. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams, while others just woke up clutching a potato they believed was their uncle. Results varied, and yes, it was traded. Some ambitious merchants sold it in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions, because who needs warning labels when you live in an era where leeches are considered sophisticated medicine? Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a plague-ridden peasant. Some folks operated in the shadowy margins of society as shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, and other semi-legitimate practitioners of medicine and mischief. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss. These were the people you visited when the local physician suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no degrees, but they had herbal knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching grandma treat boils with bark and dignity. And when it came to mind-altering substances, these folks were your go-to. They knew which plants to grind into paste, which roots to soak in wine, and how much of a given herb would make you dream of angels instead of accidentally joining them. Whether you were looking to relieve pain, induce visions, curse your neighbor, or have an out-of-body experience during laundry, they had a remedy or three. Many of these practitioners were women, midwives, wise women, and healers who were essential to their communities and deeply feared by authority figures. Not because they were cackling into cauldrons, but because they knew too much and didn't need Latin to explain it. Their remedies often included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy derivatives. They'd mix them with wine, fat, honey, or spit. Not kidding. Chant a few protective phrases and send you on your way with something that could either heal you or make you passionately confess to crimes you never committed. Of course, if anything went wrong, say a hallucination involving flying goats or the sudden urge to marry a tree, blame shifted quickly from Bad Batch to witchcraft. The church and local authorities kept one eye on these folk and the other eye nervously twitching. Still, communities relied on them. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, or when you needed to contact a dead relative to ask where they hid the rent money, these were the people you turned to. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness influencers. So, after all the salves, brews, roots, ointments, incense, bees, and questionable bread, one big question remains. How did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer? Conflicted. Deeply, hilariously conflicted. For some, especially healers and herbalists, mind-altering substances were a practical tool. If it dulled pain, slowed a fevered mind, or made childbirth 1% less horrifying, it was welcomed. This was medicine, not mischief. Sure, the patient might start reciting psalms backward or insisting the cat was speaking French. But if the swelling went down, success. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, and those dabbling in divine communication. For them, hallucinations weren't red flags. They were revelations. Visions were signs of sanctity, not symptoms. If you stared into the void and the void whispered back in Latin, you were on the fast track to sainthood, or at the very least, getting your own chapel mural. But intent mattered. Getting high by accident? Fine. Getting high to see Jesus? Acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon? Now we have a problem. That's where the church stepped in, branding certain substances. And their users are suspicious at best, heretical at worst. Anything associated with loss of control, be it intoxication, trance, or inconvenient honesty, raised clerical eyebrows. Saints could have visions, peasants probably just possessed. Meanwhile, among the common folk, opinions were more relaxed. Your neighbor's sleeping potion may have doubled as a psychedelic nightcap. People used poppy wine for pain, hashish for calm, and henbane tea for dealing with the in-laws. It wasn't seen as mystical or rebellious. It was just part of the medicine chest right next to the garlic and prayers. Ultimately, how the high was viewed came down to who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone tattled. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a weird gray area between miracle and misdemeanor, health and heresy. And in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all walked hand in hand, a little herbal escape now and then. Hardly the worst idea. In the ancient world, the sea wasn't a void to be crossed. It was the beating heart of the empire. It carried grain, gold, messages, soldiers, and sometimes war. Whoever commanded the seas didn't just own the water. They dictated the fate of entire civilizations. Unlike land warfare, where terrain shaped battles, naval warfare was about control of flow, of trade, of communication, and of access. For seafaring empires like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, naval supremacy wasn't optional. It was existential without fleets. Cities were vulnerable to isolation, starvation, and siege. With fleets, they could blockade enemies, protect merchant convoys, and even land forces deep behind enemy lines. Take the Mediterranean as an example. It wasn't called the Middle Sea for nothing. This inland ocean connected 3 continents and countless cultures. To dominate, it meant having a finger on the pulse of everything, from Phoenician trade routes to Roman grain shipments. The sea could bring wealth as swiftly as it could deliver disaster. That's why ancient powers poured resources into naval infrastructure, harbors, shipyards, dry docks, and naval academies. For Athens, the navy became its lifeblood. Themistocles' vision of a trireme-powered military turned Athens into a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire. Its ships guarded grain routes from Egypt and levied tribute from allies, and crushed Persian ambitions at battles like Salamis. Carthage, on the other hand, emerged as a naval titan for merchant routes. Its dockyards were among the most advanced of the ancient world, producing warships on an almost industrial scale. Carthaginian dominance wasn't just about military power. It was backed by generations of sailors and navigators who understood the sea like a second skin. Egypt, with its strategic location at the mouth of the Nile and Red Sea, it also relied heavily on fleets to protect trade with the Levant and Nubia. Although more riverine in orientation, Egyptian warships evolved into seafaring vessels capable of skirmishing with pirates and escorting treasure ships. In all these cases, naval warfare wasn't a sideshow. It was the main event. The sea was where rivals clashed, alliances were broken, and empires either flourished or floundered. Mastery of naval tactics, technology, and geography gave rise to legends. And when those fleets burned or sank, so too did the fortunes of the mighty. The trireme was not just a ship, it was a weapon. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it defined ancient naval warfare across the Mediterranean. And though many city-states built them, none wielded them quite like the Athenians. With 3 tiers of oars and a bronze-tipped ram, the trireme was the ancient equivalent of a guided missile, one powered by sweat, rhythm, and strategy. A typical trireme measured about 120 feet long and just 18 feet wide. Narrow, yes, but that was the point. Its slim hull allowed it to slice through water with minimal drag, while its low draft let it operate close to shore for raids and landings. The name trireme comes from its 3 rows of oars, stacked vertically. These weren't random rowers either. Each was a trained seaman, knowing how to move in unison at speeds of up to 9 knots in battle. The trireme's most fearsome feature, the ram, a bronze-sheathed prow reinforced with oak, designed to smash into enemy hulls with devastating force. But ramming wasn't just about speed. It required precise timing and angle. Hit too straight, and your own ship might get stuck or even capsize. Skilled captains like those in the Athenian navy perfected the art of the Dirkplas, a maneuver that involved slipping through enemy lines, turning quickly, and striking exposed flanks. Above deck, the trireme carried a small contingent of marines, usually around 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites and a few archers. Their role was to board enemy vessels or defend against boarding. But make no mistake, a trireme was not a floating fortress. It relied on agility, not armor. One wrong move and you were kindling. What made the Athenian trireme fleet truly revolutionary wasn't just the ship itself. It was the system behind it, funded by the Theorica, a public naval fund. Athens built and maintained hundreds of triremes. Citizens, even the poorest, served as rowers, creating a strange kind of democracy at sea. When Athens beat the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BCE, it wasn't aristocrats who rode to victory. It was the common people. Ancient naval combat wasn't a cannon-blasting slugfest. It was more like high-speed chess with the occasional ST. Brawl. The primary goal: disable or sink the enemy before they could do the same to you. And the main tool for that? Ramming. Ramming was the centerpiece of naval tactics in the trireme era. The goal was to pierce an enemy's hull below the waterline using the ship's bronze-tipped prow. A well-placed ram could send a vessel to the bottom in minutes, but it wasn't as simple as charging forward. Timing, angle, and coordination mattered immensely. Too sharp an approach and you glance off. Too direct, and you might embed your ship in theirs, leaving both vessels vulnerable. To land a successful ram, fleets used complex maneuvers like the deekplause and periplus. In a deekplause, a ship would dart through gaps in the enemy line, then pivot to strike from behind. The periplus involved circling around the enemy formation to hit exposed flanks. These weren't brute force tactics. They were precision strikes, dependent on the rower's synchronization and the captain's foresight. But sometimes things didn't go to plan. Rams missed ships locked together, or snapped. That's when Plan B came in. Boarding. Boarding turned a naval fight into a land-style melee. Once two ships collided or locked, Marines would leap aboard the enemy vessel with swords, spears, and shields. These weren't delicate affairs. Boarding was brutal close-quarters combat, more like a gang brawl than an orderly phalanx. Archers and slingers added chaos from the upper decks, picking off anyone who showed too much helmet. Some fleets, like those of the Romans, eventually favored boarding over ramming. They even built special devices like the Corvus, a boarding plank with a spike that could hook onto enemy ships and turn sea battles into floating land fights. This tactic helped Rome defeat more experienced Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War. Because what Romans lacked in seamanship, they made up for in sheer infantry strength. Of course, this also meant naval battles became even bloodier and more chaotic. There was no retreat once boarding began. It was kill or be killed on a deck slick with salt water, blood, and broken timbers. If ramming was the scalpel of ancient naval warfare, then fire was its sledgehammer. There was no more terrifying sight than a flaming ship bearing down on your fleet. Fire ships were the naval world's version of controlled chaos, a weapon so dangerous that it often threatened the attacker as much as the enemy. Though not as common as triremes or boarding actions, fire tactics emerged early and evolved over time. The basic principle was simple. Load a ship with flammable materials, pitch, tar, sulfur, resin, oil, and set it alight before sending it toward enemy vessels. Ideally, the fire ship would drift into tightly packed enemy lines, igniting sails, decks, and anything else unfortunate enough to be flammable. One of the earliest documented uses of fire ships comes from the Greco-Persian conflicts, where desperate defenders tried to repel naval invasions by hurling flaming rafts or boats toward enemy galleys in the confined spaces of a harbor or strait where maneuverability was limited. A single fire ship could cause mass panic and break formations, but fire at sea was a double-edged sword. Winds could shift, flames could backfire. A poorly timed fire ship could destroy your own fleet as easily as the enemy's. This is why fire was often reserved for desperate moments, blockades, surprise attacks, or last stands where the risk was worth the havoc. The most sophisticated development in ancient incendiary warfare came with Greek fire, a mysterious and fearsome weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire centuries later, but inspired by ancient fire tactics. Greek fire could allegedly burn on water and couldn't be extinguished with standard methods. While it's more medieval than ancient, its conceptual roots, chemical fire used in naval dominance, can be traced back to these early fire ships. Egyptian and Phoenician fleets also use variations of fire-based weapons. particularly against pirate vessels and during sieges. For instance, coastal defenders might catapult fire pots or flaming arrows onto ships attempting to breach harbors. The psychological effect of fire at sea was unmatched. A ram could be blocked, a boarder could be repelled. But fire? Fire panicked crews, devoured wooden hulls, and spread faster than orders could be shouted. Even the most experienced sailors might abandon ship at the first whiff of pitch and smoke. In the 5th century BCE, Athens transformed itself from a landlocked city-state into a dominant naval superpower, and it all started with silver. When a massive silver vein was discovered in the mines of Laurium Themistocles, an ambitious Athenian politician convinced his fellow citizens not to divide the wealth, but to invest it. His plan? Build a fleet of triremes. Lots of them. That decision changed history. With over 200 warships at its peak, the Athenian navy became the backbone of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's power was no longer rooted in hoplite infantry or stone walls. It sailed on wood, sweat, and strategy. The victory at Salamis in 480 BCE, where Themistocles' fleet trapped and annihilated the Persian navy in narrow straits, is still one of the most decisive sea battles of the ancient world. That win didn't just save Athens. It positioned it as the protector and soon ruler of the Aegean. Under the Delian League, Athens began extracting tribute from allied city-states, supposedly for mutual naval defense. In practice, this tribute was often used to fund Athens' own interests, from shipbuilding to public architecture. The navy allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project its power far beyond its borders. But it wasn't just about military might. The fleet democratized Athens. The poorest citizens, who couldn't afford armor or land to fight as hoplites, became essential rowers in the triremes. Their contribution gave them political clout, transforming the Athenian assembly and empowering the lower classes. Sea power became people power. However, this dominance came at a price. Athens' over-reliance on its navy and its coercive treatment of allies sowed resentment. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, historically a land-based power, built its own fleet with Persian money and eventually crushed the Athenian navy at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. With its fleet gone, Athens was starved into surrender. Still, the legacy of Athenian naval power endured. It showed that a city-state with limited land could become an imperial force through mastery of the sea. It also proved that ships could be political tools just as much as weapons. If Athens ruled the Aegean, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 800 BCE in what is now Tunisia, Carthage built its power not on conquest alone, but on trade, seafaring, and unmatched naval innovation. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage wasn't just a wealthy city. It was the nerve center of a sprawling maritime network that stretched from Spain to Sicily and North Africa to Sardinia. Carthaginian power was made possible by its fleet. While the Athenians refined the trireme, the Carthaginians took naval engineering to industrial levels. Their shipyards, especially the vast circular harbor of Carthage, could build and house hundreds of warships. These weren't theoretical numbers. Carthage had an assembly line-style dock system that allowed for rapid construction and repair, something unprecedented in the ancient world. Carthaginian ships, often quadriremes or quintriremes, were heavier than Athenian triremes, designed not just for speed, but for power. Their naval doctrine leaned toward ramming and boarding, supported by experienced mercenary marines and Libyan Phoenician sailors who had grown up on the sea. The city's maritime dominance wasn't only about force, it was about commerce. Carthaginian merchants navigated the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa, traded tin and silver, and brought back exotic goods. The navy ensured that pirates, rival traders, or Roman ambitions didn't interfere with this lucrative flow. And then came the Punic Wars. Rome, rising in the Italian peninsula, recognized that defeating Carthage meant building a navy from scratch. When they captured a stranded Carthaginian quincunum, they reverse-engineered it, complete with a corvus, a boarding ramp that neutralized Carthage's superior seamanship by turning sea battles into land skirmishes, despite early defeats. Carthage held its own through brilliant naval commanders and tactical mastery. In the First Punic War, The Carthaginians fought dozens of major sea battles. At Trapana, they executed a flawless maneuver that destroyed a Roman fleet despite being outnumbered, proving Carthage still knew how to command the sea. But quantity eventually overwhelmed quality. Roman persistence, better supply lines, and brutal discipline turned the tide by the end of the Second Punic War. Carthage's fleet was gone, its shipyards dismantled, and its power broken. Still, the legend of Carthaginian naval dominance endures. They weren't just warriors on the water. They were master merchants, innovative shipbuilders, and bold navigators who once ruled the seas through wit, wealth, and wood. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids, pharaohs, and temples, not fleets. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to embrace naval power, both on the Nile and at sea. Its ships may not have been as famous as Greek triremes or Carthaginian quinquiremes, but for thousands of years, Egypt relied on watercraft to maintain its empire, transport troops, and protect its economic lifelines. The Nile was Egypt's highway, an artery that connected north and south, desert and delta as early as 3000 BCE. Egyptian shipbuilders were crafting vessels from bundled papyrus reeds and later cedar, wood imported from Lebanon. These riverboats transported grain, gold, soldiers, and even colossal statues. Pharaohs led naval expeditions southward into Nubia and eastward across the Red Sea to Punt, a mysterious land rich in incense, ivory, and exotic animals. But Egypt's naval ambitions weren't limited to the river. By the time of the New Kingdom, see it in 1550-1070 BCE, Egypt developed seagoing fleets capable of challenging pirates, repelling invasions and projecting power beyond its borders. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Ramesses III, Egypt used warships in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders who threatened the eastern Mediterranean. These battles, recorded in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, show Egyptian archers firing from ships and marines engaging in brutal close combat aboard narrow wooden decks. Unlike the odd triremes of Greece, Egyptian seafaring ships were broad, sail-driven vessels with limited maneuverability. They often featured raised fighting platforms and were crewed by archers, spearmen, and sailors trained in both combat and navigation. Their primary advantage was mobility along coasts and rivers, where they could rapidly deploy soldiers or intercept merchant traffic. Egyptian naval strength also underpinned its economy. Grain exports to the Levant and trade with the Aegean were secured by escort ships. Ports like Byblos and Tanis became hubs of both commerce and naval logistics. Even foreign rulers sought Egyptian shipbuilders for their craftsmanship. In time, Egypt's naval power waned under successive waves of foreign rule. Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. But its long legacy of riverine and coastal warfare set the foundation for naval traditions in the ancient Near East. Egypt's ships may not have ruled the open sea, but they ruled the rhythm of empire, sailing where the Nile flowed, where the winds allowed, and where power demanded. When the Roman Republic first rose to prominence, it was not a naval power. Rome's strength lay in its disciplined legions and arty, building prowess, not shipbuilding. But that changed dramatically and rapidly when the Republic found itself in a bitter contest for control of the Mediterranean against Carthage. The result was one of the most dramatic naval transformations in ancient history. At the start of the First Punic War, 264 BCE, Rome had almost no fleet. Carthage, meanwhile, had centuries of maritime dominance, but the Romans weren't deterred. According to legend, they captured a Carthaginian quinquirim and used it as a prototype. Within months, they mass-produced a navy, assembling hundreds of ships through sheer manpower and state-level organization. But Rome knew it couldn't outsail the Carthaginians, so it changed the rules of the game. Enter the Corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with a metal spike. This device turned sea battles into infantry brawls, Rome's specialty. With it, Roman marines could board enemy ships en masse, transforming naval combat into something far more familiar to Roman soldiers. The results were dramatic. In battles like Mylae and Cape Icnemus, Rome's relatively inexperienced sailors defeated veteran Carthaginian crews through sheer aggression and the effectiveness of the Corvus. Eventually, the Corvus was abandoned. It made ships dangerously top-heavy, but had already turned the tide of the war. By the Second Punic War, Rome's naval infrastructure had matured. Its fleets patrolled the western Mediterranean, protected supply lines to Iberia and Africa, and disrupted Hannibal's ability to reinforce his forces from Carthage. Naval blockades and amphibious landings became standard tactics. Under the Empire, Roman control of the seas expanded further. The Classis Missinensis and Classis Ravennatus were two of the main imperial fleets, stationed to protect trade routes, suppress piracy, and transport troops. Though not always at the forefront of warfare, the Navy provided vital logistical and strategic support, keeping the empire interconnected. Unlike Athens or Carthage, Rome didn't build a maritime identity. It used the sea as a tool, something to be mastered when necessary. And yet by the 1st century CE, the Mare Nostrum, or sea, was more than a boast. It was reality. Rome may have been born on land, but its destiny was sealed on water. Through adaptation, innovation, and relentless will, it turned the sea from a vulnerability into a fortress. Ancient naval warfare didn't just influence battles. It shaped borders, economies, empires, and even cultures. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, control of the sea meant more than victory on the water. It meant influence over the movement of ideas, trade, languages, and power structures that would echo for centuries. First, consider how navies forged empires. Athens became a cultural and economic powerhouse because of its naval strength. Carthage turned maritime mastery into a mercantile empire. Rome, despite its late start at sea, used naval superiority to control the entire Mediterranean basin. Each of these powers had land armies, but it was their fleets that let them strike across continents, defend distant territories, and choke enemy economies. The sea also served as a cultural conduit. Greek colonists traveled by ship to establish outposts across Italy and Asia Minor, spreading art, religion, and language. Egyptian ships brought papyrus, gold, and sacred knowledge to foreign courts. Phoenician mariners transmitted their alphabet and their gods to nearly every shore they touched. Naval power was never just martial, it was civilizational. Technologically, ancient navies pushed shipbuilding to new heights. The development of the trireme and later larger polyremes was not just military advancement, it was a revolution in engineering. Harbors became logistical hubs. Navigation techniques improved. Standardized ship designs laid the groundwork for maritime architecture, still visible in later Byzantine and Islamic navies. Even economic systems evolved because of navies. Protected sea routes allowed for stable trade across vast distances, enabling luxury goods like silks, spices, wine, and tin to move between far-flung cultures. Cities with strong fleets like Alexandria or Rhodes became wealthy cosmopolitan centers where fleets thrived. So did markets, artists, scholars, and revolutionaries. And then there was the psychological legacy. Fire ships, ramming tactics, boarding actions. These left lasting impressions on how warfare was imagined. They introduced the idea that the sea itself could be a weapon, that mobility and control, rather than just brute force, could win wars. Today, we remember many of these empires for their land conquests, but their sea conquests were just as vital and often more enduring. Ancient naval warfare wasn't just about who had the fastest ship or the sharpest ram. It was about who understood the sea as a stage, not just for war, but for history itself. In the end, the triremes may be gone, but their wake still ripples through time. Cyrus the Great was born around 600 BCE. In the region of Anshan, then a vassal kingdom under Median rule, his family, the Achaemenids, claimed noble descent and ruled a small but respected Persian domain. But nothing about Cyrus's early life hinted that he would one day create one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And yet, from the very beginning, legend surrounded him. Greek historian Herodotus gives us one of the most dramatic origin stories in ancient biography. According to Herodotus, King Astyages of Media, Cyrus's grandfather, had a dream that his daughter's son would overthrow him. Interpreters confirmed his worst fear. The child would be a threat to his throne. So Astyages married his daughter Mandane to a Persian noble, Cambyses the Fair, hoping the baby would remain politically insignificant. But the dreams persisted. When Cyrus was born, Astyages took no chances. He ordered a loyal servant, Harpagus, to kill the child. Harpagus, reluctant to commit such an act, delegated the gruesome task to a shepherd. But instead of abandoning the infant, the shepherd raised Cyrus as his own, hiding him in the mountains and treating him like a common herder's son. As Cyrus grew, so did his charisma. Even as a boy, he stood out, commanding other children, displaying leadership beyond his years. Eventually, rumors reached the court, a noble child living as a shepherd. Astyages investigated, and the truth unraveled. Surprisingly, he spared Cyrus, perhaps seeing no threat or perhaps haunted by guilt. Harpagus, however, was not so lucky in a grim punishment. Astyages killed Harpagus's son and served him as a meal at court. Meanwhile, Cyrus was sent back to Persia to live under his father Cambyses' care, now recognized openly as a prince of noble blood. What the Median king didn't know was that he had just ensured his own downfall, for Cyrus's time among shepherds and nobles alike gave him a unique understanding of people, both the powerful and the humble. Whether Herodotus's version is fact or fable, the story captures the aura that would always surround Cyrus. From near death in infancy to destiny-defying survival, his early life planted the seeds of greatness. He would not only challenge Astyages, but redefine kingship itself. By the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus was no longer just a Persian prince. He was a calculating and ambitious leader poised to challenge the regional status quo. At that time, the Median Empire, ruled by King Astyages, still held sway over Persia. But the balance of power was shifting, and Cyrus was ready to tip the scales. The catalyst was betrayal. According to multiple sources, including Herodotus and the Babylonian Chronicle, the Median general Harpagus, the very man ordered years earlier to kill baby Cyrus, had never forgotten the cruel fate of his son. Now, years later, he was in a position to act. Secretly, he sent messages to Cyrus, encouraging him to rise up and promising support from within the Median ranks. It was the beginning of a revolt that would shake the ancient world. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus officially rebelled. Persia, once a subordinate kingdom, now declared independence and war. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a series of prolonged campaigns. Over 3 years, Cyrus's forces pushed deeper into Median territory, drawing support from disaffected nobles and regional allies. His reputation grew not just for military competence, but for restraint. He often spared the lives of surrendered enemies, earning both fear and admiration. Meanwhile, Astyages' court was unraveling. Loyalty eroded. When the final confrontation came around 550 BCE, it wasn't the Medes who triumphed. It was Cyrus. Astyages was betrayed by his own army, and the once mighty Median Empire crumbled almost overnight. Cyrus entered Ecbatana, the Median capital, not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a new kind of ruler. He respected local traditions, preserved Median administrative structures, and incorporated many Medes into his growing government. This policy of inclusion would become a hallmark of his rule. With the Media under his control, Cyrus unified the Iranian plateau. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. By overthrowing the Medes, he not only liberated Persia from vassalage, but also inherited their empire. He now ruled lands stretching from modern-day Iran to parts of Central Asia. Fresh from his triumph over the Medes, Cyrus the Great turned his gaze westward, toward the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary Croesus. Croesus was no ordinary king. He was one of the richest men of his time, his name becoming a byword for immense wealth. His capital, Sardis, gleamed with luxury, and his armies were well equipped with cavalry and seasoned troops. But Croesus made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Cyrus, seeking to preempt Persian expansion. Croesus formed alliances with Egypt and Babylon and consulted the Oracle of Delphi. The oracle famously told him that if he crossed the river Halys to attack Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged, Croesus launched an invasion, only to discover that the empire he would destroy was his own. The two forces clashed near the Halys River in 547 BCE. After a fiercely contested battle, Croesus withdrew to Sardis, believing the campaign season had ended and that he could regroup in the spring with allied reinforcements. But Cyrus did something unexpected. He pursued. In a bold winter campaign, Cyrus besieged Sardis, forcing Croesus into a desperate defense. According to Herodotus, Cyrus even employed a tactical surprise. He used camels to startle the Lydian cavalry, Croesus's strongest asset, rendering them ineffective. Within weeks, Sardis fell. Croesus was captured alive. What happened next sealed Cyrus's reputation as a ruler, unlike any other. Instead of executing Croesus, Cyrus reportedly spared him, even making him an advisor. The story goes that as Croesus was about to be burned alive, he cried out Solon's name, a Greek philosopher who once warned him not to count a lucky man until he knew how his life ended. Cyrus, moved by the tale and the wisdom in it, ordered the fire extinguished. Whether myth or truth, this narrative reflects Cyrus's known policy of clemency. With Lydia conquered, Cyrus gained control over its immense treasury and trade networks, along with the powerful Greek city-states of Ionia along the Aegean coast. Though the Ionian cities resisted Persian rule, they were no match for Cyrus's expanding military and diplomatic machine. The fall of Croesus marked more than the collapse of a rich kingdom. It confirmed Cyrus's tactical brilliance and willingness to use both warfare and mercy. It also gave Persia a foothold in the Greek world, setting the stage for future East-West conflicts. And for Cyrus, it was just the next step in a rapidly expanding empire. By the late 540s BCE, only one major power remained between Cyrus and undisputed dominance of the Near East, Babylon. Once ruled by kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had grown into a magnificent metropolis, famed for its towering ziggurats, massive double walls, and the fabled hanging gardens. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. At the time, Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, a king deeply unpopular with his own people. His religious policies alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, the city's chief deity. He had spent years away from Babylon, leaving the empire in the hands of his son Belshazzar, a name familiar to readers of the Hebrew Bible. Discontent was growing. Cyrus sensed opportunity. In 539 BCE, Cyrus launched his campaign, but unlike previous invasions marked by siege and destruction, this one was surgical. Cyrus's forces defeated Babylonian troops at Opis, a key city on the Tigris. There they won not only with military power, but with propaganda. The Persians promised to liberate the people from the misrule of Nabonidus, presenting Cyrus as a restorer of divine order. The most astonishing part? When Cyrus entered Babylon, he did so without a fight. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and later Greek sources, the city gates were opened to him, perhaps through political negotiation, perhaps due to internal betrayal. Regardless, Cyrus marched into Babylon as a liberator, not a conqueror. He respected the city's temples, participated in religious ceremonies, and declared in the famous Cyrus Cylinder that he had been chosen by Marduk himself to restore peace and justice. This document, often called the world's first charter of human rights, records Cyrus's policies of tolerance, temple restoration, and repatriation of displaced peoples. Among those affected were the Jews, exiled from Jerusalem decades earlier by Babylonian kings. Cyrus issued an edict allowing them to return home and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, an act so significant that the Hebrew Bible refers to him as God's anointed, a title otherwise reserved for Israelite kings. After entering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great didn't just take the throne, he rewrote the rules of the empire. One of the most remarkable artifacts of his reign is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, often hailed as the world's first charter of human rights. While modern scholars debate that claim, there's no doubt that the cylinder offers a revolutionary glimpse into how Cyrus saw power, not as domination, but as stewardship. In the text, Cyrus proclaims himself chosen by Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, to restore order and justice after the misrule of Nabonidus. But this wasn't mere flattery. Cyrus backed his words with action. He restored temples to their proper function, allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, and explicitly stated that he would not oppress his subjects or alter their local traditions. One of the most famous outcomes of this policy was the liberation of the Jews from Babylonian exile after decades in captivity. The Jewish people were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their destroyed temple. The Book of Ezra in the Hebrew Bible records Cyrus's decree, praising him as an instrument of divine will, extraordinary for a foreign king. In fact, Cyrus is the only non-Jew ever referred to in the Bible as a Messiah or anointed one. The Cyrus cylinder speaks in terms of freedom, restoration, and legitimacy through justice. A striking contrast to the standard rhetoric of ancient rulers who often glorified conquest and divine punishment. Instead of boasting about destroying cities or enslaving enemies, Cyrus highlights his role as a protector of diverse cultures and faiths. This wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy. By respecting local customs, he avoided rebellion and fostered loyalty across his vast empire. Although we must be cautious not to project modern legal concepts onto ancient texts, the spirit of the Cyrus cylinder remains remarkable. It envisions a world where rulers derive legitimacy not from fear, but from benevolence and inclusion. Today, a replica of the cylinder is displayed at the United Nations headquarters, a testament to its symbolic weight as an early blueprint for pluralistic governance. Cyrus the Great didn't just conquer a vast empire, he held it together. That might sound simple on paper, but in reality he ruled over an incredibly diverse world. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, Lydians, Hebrews, and countless others, all with their own languages, gods, customs, and grievances. What made Cyrus truly great was not how far he extended his borders, but how skillfully he managed what lay within them at the core of Cyrus's governance. It was a philosophy of tolerance through structure. Unlike many ancient rulers who imposed their culture and religion upon conquered peoples, Cyrus embraced a decentralized model. He allowed local leaders to remain in place, local religions to flourish, and local customs to continue. Rather than crush his subjects into submission, he sought to win their trust, and it worked. He retained and adapted the administrative systems of the Medes and Babylonians, blending them with Persian practices to create a uniquely flexible empire. Power was delegated to satraps or provincial governors who oversaw taxation, security, and justice in the regions. These officials were typically chosen from local elites, but remained accountable to Cyrus's central authority. This system became the foundation of Achaemenid rule for generations. Cyrus also invested in infrastructure. He improved trade routes, safeguarded caravans, and ensured fair treatment for merchants, knowing that commerce was as essential to stability as armies. His empire wasn't just a military machine, it was an economic and cultural network that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. He also understood the power of symbolism. In each city he conquered, Cyrus made gestures of respect, restoring temples and participating in religious ceremonies, and preserving local institutions. These acts weren't simply theatrical, they were diplomatic strategies that earned him the loyalty of former enemies. Most remarkable was how little resistance his rule provoked. Cyrus didn't just avoid rebellions, he often inspired admiration. Even the Greeks, typically disdainful of barbarians, viewed him as a wise and just king. Xenophon, the Athenian historian, would later write Cyropedia, a partly fictionalized but deeply admiring biography of Cyrus, presenting him as the model of enlightened leadership. By the end of his reign, Cyrus the Great had reshaped the ancient world. From the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, his empire stretched farther than any before it. But like many great conquerors, his ambition pushed him toward one final campaign, this time into the steppes of the northeast. It would be his last. Around 530 BCE, Cyrus set out to confront the Massati, a confederation of nomadic tribes living east of the Caspian Sea. These fierce horse-riding warriors were led by Queen Tamiris, a ruler remembered as both a military leader and a symbol of defiance. Her people were seen by Persians as uncivilized but dangerous, a threat to the empire's expanding borders. The details of the campaign are murky, shaped largely by Herodotus's dramatic and likely embellished account. According to the Greek historian, Cyrus first attempted diplomacy, proposing marriage to Queen Tamiris. She saw it for what it was, a political ploy. When diplomacy failed, Cyrus resorted to trickery. He left behind a banquet of wine and rich food, knowing the Massages were unaccustomed to alcohol. After a drunken celebration, many of her warriors were ambushed and slaughtered, including her son. Devastated and enraged, Tamiris swore vengeance. In the climactic battle that followed, the Massagetae overwhelmed the Persian forces. Cyrus was killed in combat. Herodotus even claims that Tamiris had his body decapitated and placed his severed head in a skin filled with blood, declaring, "Drink your fill of blood, you who thirsted for it." While the gruesome ending may be more myth than fact, what's certain is this: Cyrus died during this campaign, far from the great cities he had conquered. His body was eventually returned to Pasargadae, the capital he founded in Persia, and buried in a modest yet dignified tomb, still standing today as a testament to his legacy. His death marked the end of an era. The throne passed to his son Cambyses II, who would continue the empire's expansion, notably into Egypt. But Cyrus's unique blend of tolerance, strategy, and visionary leadership would not be easily replicated. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind more than a vast empire. He left behind a political blueprint, a philosophical precedent, and a reputation so revered that even centuries later, his name inspired awe. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus, was the largest the world had ever seen to that point, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. But it wasn't just size that mattered, it was how it functioned. Cyrus's policies of inclusion, tolerance, and administrative innovation continued under his successors. His son, Cambyses II, and later Darius the Great, didn't just expand the empire. They formalized its structure. The satrapy system Cyrus pioneered became a cornerstone of imperial governance. These regional governors maintained law and order, collected taxes, and answered directly to the king, allowing the empire to remain both vast and surprisingly efficient. Religious and cultural freedom remained official policy. Temples and local deities were respected across the empire, from Babylonian ziggurats to Egyptian sanctuaries. Local elites were often kept in power under Persian oversight, and rebellions were rare in the early Achaemenid years, not because of fear, but because many subjects found Persian rule less oppressive than the regimes they had previously endured. Cyrus also helped to establish the idea of kingship as a moral role, not just a political one. He wasn't merely king of Persia. He took on titles like King of the Four Corners of the World. But unlike the boastful tyrants of the past, his legitimacy was tied to the well-being of his subjects. This wasn't just propaganda. It reflected a real shift in imperial philosophy. Good governance was part of greatness. Even in death, Cyrus's influence was felt. His tomb at Pasargadae, a simple limestone structure, stood as a symbol of humility and permanence. Alexander the Great, himself a master of empire centuries later, visited Cyrus's tomb and reportedly paid homage, ordering its restoration after it was desecrated. In Persia, Cyrus was not just remembered, he was revered. Later Persian dynasties would invoke his legacy to legitimize their own rule. Zoroastrian priests associated him with divine justice, and Iranian national identity continues to celebrate him as the father of the nation. Cyrus the Great's influence didn't end with his death, or even with the fall of his empire. Over the centuries, his legacy grew beyond borders, faiths, and cultures, cementing him not just as a Persian hero, but as a globally admired figure whose example echoed through time. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus is described not as a pagan tyrant, but as a divinely appointed liberator. The book of Isaiah refers to him as the anointed of the Lord, a title otherwise reserved for Israelite kings. His decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple marked a turning point in Jewish history. For many, he remains a righteous Gentile, a rare example of a powerful ruler who used his might to restore, not destroy, faith and freedom. In Greece, despite centuries of conflict with Persia, Cyrus was often portrayed the model monarch. The Athenian writer Xenophon, a student of Socrates, wrote the Cyropaedia, a partly fictionalized account of Cyrus's life that presented him as the ideal ruler, wise, just, moderate, and brave. Though not a strict historical biography, it shaped Hellenistic and Roman thought about leadership and ethics for centuries to come. In Islamic tradition, some scholars and commentators have identified Cyrus with Tulkarnin, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran, a righteous king who built a great wall to protect people from chaos and injustice. While this identification is debated, it reflects the respect Cyrus commands across Abrahamic traditions. Modern historians and political leaders have also looked to Cyrus for inspiration. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson reportedly kept a copy of the Cyropedia at his bedside. In the 20th century, Iran's last Shah invoked Cyrus as a symbol of national unity and reform. And today, Cyrus's Cyrus Cylinder, often dubbed the world's first declaration of human rights, is displayed at the United Nations as a symbol of tolerance and governance. Cyrus's appeal transcends conquest. He's remembered not for cruelty or empire building alone, but for his rare ability to wield power with justice. He showed that an empire didn't have to crush difference to maintain control, and that rulers could win loyalty through respect, not fear. More than 2 millennia later, Cyrus the Great remains a paradox, a conqueror celebrated for his compassion, a king praised by those he conquered. Few figures in history command such wide admiration, and fewer still deserve it as much. In the blistering sun of the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians made a bold choice. Many of them shaved their heads, but this wasn't a practical decision alone. It was a symbol, a statement, a clean canvas. And upon that canvas, they placed some of the most elaborate wigs the ancient world ever saw. Wigs in ancient Egypt weren't just fashionable. They were essential markers of identity, status, and purity. Men and women of high rank didn't just wear them, they flaunted them. These weren't simple accessories either. They could be made of real human hair, imported horsehair, or finely woven plant fibers. Wealthy elites often commissioned wigs with multiple layers, intricate braiding, gold beads, and even perfumed cones placed atop them, wax-based scents that would melt slowly in the sun, covering them in luxury. For women, hairstyles were tied to femininity, fertility, and power. A noblewoman's wig might be adorned with floral decorations, colorful bands, or precious metal clasps. A priestess might wear hers in tight, symmetrical rows, echoing the divine order of the gods. For men, especially those in service to Pharaoh, a thick, stylized wig reflected not just wealth, but closeness to the divine hierarchy. Children, however, had their own style. Many wore the side lock of youth, a shaved head with one ornate braid left dangling, a symbol of childhood that would be cut off during adulthood or religious rites of passage. And then there were the bald priests. In sharp contrast to the extravagance of court wigs, priests were required to shave their entire bodies, including their heads, to maintain ritual purity. In public ceremonies, though, even they might wear ceremonial wigs, symbolizing their spiritual roles more than their individual identity. What's more fascinating is how wigs even served after death. Mummies were often buried with wigs in place, ensuring their status and beauty carried into the afterlife. Hair, in other words, wasn't just vanity. It was an eternal identity. If you picture a Viking, you likely imagine wild beards and braided hair, an image forged from equal parts archaeology, Norse sagas, and Hollywood. But there's a surprising truth in that vision. Viking hairstyles were far from random. In fact, hair was a powerful symbol in Norse society of identity, masculinity, clan loyalty, and even seduction. Both Viking men and women took their hair seriously. In a world where physical appearance projected strength and honor, long hair wasn't a vanity, it was a statement. Men often grew their hair long and styled it meticulously. Braids, top knots, and half-shaved heads weren't just stylish, they were intimidating. A warrior walking into battle with braided locks and a thick beard wasn't just practical keeping hair out of the eyes. He was broadcasting his readiness to fight and his resistance to fear. For Viking women, hair could be just as symbolic. Long, well-groomed hair was a marker of femininity and high status. Women often braided their hair in complex patterns, sometimes using ribbons or beads woven into the strands. A married woman might wear her hair wrapped or partially covered to signal her marital status, similar to how wedding rings work today. Some burial sites in Scandinavia even include combs, hairpins, and grooming tools, suggesting daily care and pride in appearance were important to both sexes. There was also a fascinating legal angle. In Viking law codes, hair played a role in justice. Cutting off someone's hair without permission was considered a grave insult, one that could lead to revenge, legal retribution, or full-blown blood feuds. That's because hair represents honor. To disgrace a warrior by chopping his locks was to attack his social standing itself. And then there's mythology. The Norse gods themselves had iconic hair. Thor with his flaming red beard, Loki's transformation tricks often involved changes in hair or shape. And of course, the goddess Sif, whose golden hair was so legendary that when Loki cut it off as a prank, he had to beg the dwarves to forge a magical replacement from real gold. Hair wasn't just mortal identity, it was divine currency. The Romans knew a thing or two about control, and that extended to their hairstyles. In a world where politics, class, and gender were all tightly regulated, hair became one of the subtlest yet most powerful tools of social navigation. Especially in elite circles, your locks could literally declare your allegiance, your values, and your ambition. Let's start with Roman men. In the early Republic, the ideal Roman citizen was clean-cut, conservative, and practical. Hair was short, tidy, and well-groomed. Anything longer than that was considered suspect, effeminate, foreign, or lazy. A short haircut and a clean-shaven face weren't just fashion choices, they were civic statements. They said, "I'm disciplined. I serve the state. I'm Roman." But as the empire progressed, things got fluffier. Emperors like Nero and Commodus let their curls grow out in flamboyant styles that mimicked Greek philosophers or even divine statues. Some sported what we now call the Roman top knot, a raised section of curled or piled hair at the front, sculpted to suggest intellect, youth, or refinement. These weren't accidents. They were carefully crafted public images. Hair became propaganda. For Roman women, the stakes were even higher. Hairstyles became almost architectural. The famous Flavian Tower style, a literal mountain of curls and braids pinned above the head, with a high-status look made possible only by slave labor, hot irons, and hours of work. The more elaborate the hairdo, the wealthier the woman, because it meant she had the leisure time and servants to maintain it. Hair could also show political loyalty. Empresses often debuted new styles in statues and coinage, which were then copied by upper-class women across the empire. Wearing a hairdo like the empress wasn't just flattery, it was allegiance. Meanwhile, enslaved people were often forced to keep their hair short or plain, denying them this form of expression entirely. Soldiers likewise wore practical cuts, reinforcing unity and function over flair. And then there were the rebels. Some Romans deliberately grew long hair or adopted barbarian styles to show disdain for imperial values. For example, gladiators often wore dramatic hairstyles to build stage personas, part athlete, part celebrity, part threat. In ancient Japan, hair wasn't merely a personal feature. It was an emblem of discipline, duty, and deeply rooted tradition. Nowhere was this more visible than in the iconic charmage, the distinctive top knot worn by samurai. This wasn't just a haircut, it was a cultural contract. Originally, the shanmage began as a practical choice. The shaved crown kept helmets, especially the kabuto. Samurai wore helmets more comfortable and secure in battle. But over time, as peace settled in during the Edo period, the style became less about combat and more about identity. The top knot became a rigid symbol of warrior status, honor and submission to Bushido, the way of the warrior. Cutting it off wasn't just a haircut, it was symbolic death. A disgraced samurai might be ordered to remove his top knot or do it himself as a sign that he was no longer worthy of his rank. In extreme cases, the cutting of the top knot preceded seppuku, the ritual suicide performed to atone for shame. The hair of Japanese women also conveyed powerful social messages. During the Heian period, 794-1185, noblewomen grew their hair extraordinarily long, sometimes longer than their bodies, and allowed it to cascade straight down their backs in a style known as subarakashi. This wasn't just beauty, it was elegance, patience, and status. Maintaining such length required immense care, time, and wealth, traits exclusive to the aristocracy. Later, during the Edo period, women's hairstyles became increasingly ornate and stylized. Styles like the shimada, a kind of coiled bun, were adorned with pins, combs, and decorations, each one coded with meaning. Certain styles indicated marital status, age, or even profession. Courtesans and geishas, for example, used dazzling and elaborate hairstyles not only to attract clients, but to signal their training stage and experience level. Hair could also be a form of rebellion. During certain shogunate rules, laws were passed restricting hairstyles based on class. Violating those codes, even by letting your hair grow the wrong way, could draw suspicion or punishment. And yet artists, actors, and even Ronin masterless samurai often bent the rules to make bold statements about identity and resistance. In ancient Japan, hair was bound, literally and figuratively, by duty, devotion, and drama, whether in the silent dignity of a samurai or the elegant swirl atop a geisha's head. Coiffures were acts of storytelling, honor, and deep cultural memory. Across ancient Africa, hair wasn't just a personal style, it was a language. From the intricate cornrows of the Sahel to the towering coils of the Himba, hairstyles served as identity cards, spiritual expressions, and even survival tools. Long before colonial disruption, African hair culture was a rich tapestry of symbolism, craftsmanship, and resistance. Let's begin in ancient Egypt's southern neighbor, Nubia. Nubian communities, often unfairly eclipsed in mainstream history, developed stylized braids and twists that communicated status, age, and clan. Nubian queens like Amani Tor and Amana Shakito wore complex braided wigs and headpieces that rivaled even Egyptian royalty, asserting their power and beauty in bold, unmistakable terms. Further in what is now Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo peoples were already treating hair as an artistic medium. Intricate styles weren't just for show. They were carefully planned, with certain patterns reserved for brides, warriors, or spiritual initiates. Hairdressers were highly respected, almost priest-like in their roles. To entrust someone with your hair was to trust them with your essence. Among the Himba people of Namibia, red ochre paste made from powdered stone and butterfat is still used today to coat and sculpt elaborate braids. These ochre styles don't just protect hair from the desert climate. They signify everything from puberty to marital status. For Himba women, hair is literally shaped by the seasons of life. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of African hair history lies in how it encoded resistance. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans used hairstyles as silent forms of rebellion and remembrance. Cornrows weren't just practical, they were maps. Some patterns symbolized escape routes or safe meeting points. Others preserved ancestral styles from back home, defying erasure with every twist and braid. In many African cultures, shave heads marked mourning or spiritual transitions, while thick dreadlocks could represent strength, connection to the divine, or warriorhood. Hair was sacred, never just aesthetic. Colonialism would later stigmatize these hairstyles, pushing Eurocentric ideals of beauty. But the ancient roots of African hair culture were never fully erased. They lived on in memory, in hands, in braids passed from mother to daughter, and are now being reclaimed around the world. In ancient Greece, where marble statues and epics shaped the Western imagination, hair wasn't just a matter of personal grooming. It was a public performance of virtue, intellect, and civilization. From the tight curls of Athenian youths to the flowing locks of philosophers, hair helped define who you were in the eyes of both the gods and your fellow citizens. Let's start with the men. Early on, Greek men often wore long hair tied back with ribbons or bands. Homeric heroes like Achilles and Odysseus are described in epic verse as having flowing or shining hair, symbolizing vitality, nobility, and divine favor. In these early periods, long hair was masculine and heroic. But by the classical era, things had changed. A well-groomed, moderately short haircut became the new ideal for Athenian men. The beard, however, stayed. It was the combo of choice for philosophers, statesmen, and teachers. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all bearded. The beard was associated with wisdom and maturity. While a clean forehead and exposed face conveyed openness and reason, a long beard without long, wild hair suggested intellect over impulse, logic over emotion. In contrast, slaves and foreigners were sometimes forced to shave their heads as a mark of submission or inferiority. So, in a strange twist, having hair, at least the right kind, was a political privilege. Women's hair, on the other hand, was deeply tied to domestic virtue. In public, respectable women were expected to wear their hair up and covered, braided, or coiled into buns. Hair hanging loose was often reserved for specific rituals, particularly mourning or ecstatic religious practices like the Dionysian cults, where unbound hair symbolized a break from order and social norms. Girls wore their hair down until puberty, after which their first braid was often cut and dedicated to Artemis as part of coming-of-age ritual. This act symbolized both the end of childhood and the beginning of societal responsibility. Greek goddesses also had signature hair. Athena's neatly arranged war helmet style symbolized strategy and discipline. Aphrodite's flowing curls represented sensuality and divine beauty. Hairstyles helped mortals align with deities, borrowing divine traits by mimicking their forms. In ancient China, hair was inseparable from moral philosophy, family duty, and imperial control. From the smooth top knots of Confucian scholars to the ornate buns of Tang Dynasty court ladies, every strand served a purpose, both aesthetic and symbolic. Hair was not to be altered lightly. In fact, cutting it was often considered a grave offense. Why? Because of Confucian filial piety. One of the core tenets of Confucianism was that your body, hair included, was a sacred gift from your parents. To cut, damage, or otherwise change it unnecessarily was a sign of disrespect. This belief permeated Chinese society for centuries. Even criminals faced hair shaving not just as a punishment, but as a ritual humiliation and spiritual severance. Men typically wore their hair long and tied it into a top knot or bun. Scholars, poets, and officials would often pair this with long robes and caps, signifying wisdom, composure, and loyalty to order. To see a man with loose or unkempt hair in public was deeply unsettling. It implied madness, mourning, or rebellion. For women, hairstyles were highly age and status dependent. Young girls often wore twin buns or side ponytails, style that marked them as unmarried. Upon marriage, a woman's hair would be restyled into a more mature and formal arrangement, often a single coil or bun pinned with combs, jade ornaments, or gold hair sticks. Court ladies and empresses during the Tang Dynasty took things to spectacular heights, literally. Their hair was sculpted into towering arrangements adorned with phoenix pins, flowers, and silk. There was also politics in hair. Dynastic shifts often brought forced changes in appearance. When the Manchu-led Qing dynasty conquered Ming China, they enforced the Qiu hairstyle, the front of the head shaved with the rest braided into a long pigtail. This style was a hated symbol of submission to foreign rule. Many Han Chinese resisted, choosing death over what they saw as a betrayal of cultural identity. In contrast, Taoist monks shaved their heads entirely to reject worldly attachments. Buddhist monks did the same, demonstrating their detachment from the material realm and their embrace of impermanence. In ancient India, hair wasn't just a physical feature, it was sacred. It intertwined with ritual purity, caste identity, and spiritual symbolism, becoming a powerful medium of both devotion and social control from the twisted dreadlocks of sages to the shaved heads of pilgrims. Hair in Indian culture told complex stories of belief, discipline, and transformation. Let's begin with the sadhus, wandering holy men who renounced worldly life. Their hair was never cut, combed, or constrained. Instead, they let it grow into thick, matted dreadlocks called jata. These locks symbolized their spiritual power and detachment from material concerns. The longer and wilder the hair, the more potent the message. This person had transcended vanity, family, and even identity. Sadhus emulated Lord Shiva, the god of destruction and meditation, whose own jata was said to hold back the mighty Ganges River. For others, however, shaved heads were the height of sanctity. In Hindu traditions, pilgrims often shaved their heads before visiting sacred sites, offering their hair as a symbol of surrender and purification. Children's first haircuts, mundane, were key rites of passage, believed to cleanse bad karma from previous lives. Mourning rituals also required close male relatives to shave their heads, symbolizing humility and detachment from worldly attachments. Hair also communicated caste and marital status. Upper caste men traditionally kept a single tuft of hair at the crown, the shika, after shaving the rest of the head. This top knot wasn't random. It marked them as twice born, part of the priestly or scholarly class, and obligated to perform sacred rites. Cutting the shika without cause was akin to social death. Women's hairstyles were equally symbolic. Unmarried girls typically wore their hair loose or in simple braids, while married women bound their hair into buns or coiled styles. A well-oiled, neatly braided style denoted discipline, beauty, and family honor. Ornamentation varied by region and wealth, but jasmine flowers, Gold clips and decorative combs were commonly worn during festivals and weddings. Hair was also linked to erotic power. Ancient texts like the Kama Sutra describe sensual hair arrangements, while sculptures at temple sites like Khajuraho depict women with intricately styled hair, cascading down their backs like liquid sculpture. Throughout the ancient world, hairstyles weren't just about fitting in. They were also used to stand out, resist, and rebel. In many societies, changing or rejecting a dominant hairstyle became an act of defiance, subtle or overt, against cultural norms, imperial powers, or oppressive systems. Let's begin in Judea. Under Roman rule, the Jewish people, governed by strict religious law, avoided the elaborate grooming favored by Roman elites. Many Jewish men refused to shave their beards or style their hair in Roman fashion, preserving a distinct identity rooted in spiritual observance. To them, hair wasn't fashion, it was faith, and in an empire obsessed with assimilation. That made their appearance the quiet form of protest. In ancient Gaul, during Julius Caesar's conquest, the Celts were known for their wild lime-washed hair, standing stiff and bright, often spiked into mohawk-like crests. Roman writers saw it as barbaric, but for the Gauls it was war paint in follicle form. The hairstyle both terrified enemies and bonded tribes in resistance to Roman occupation. The Parthians and later the Sassanids, two great empires east of Rome, also weaponized appearance. Their kings wore long, curled hair and thick beards, symbols of divine authority and cultural pride. To the Romans, it looked exotic and effeminate. To the Persians, it was royal and ancestral. Their hair became a statement. We are not you. Even in more constrained societies, hair could be wielded as resistance. Enslaved people in various empires, from Greece to the Americas, were often forced to shave their heads to strip them of identity. But when they were able, they used hair to preserve lineage memory and rebellion. Braids concealed seeds, beads held meaning, and styles recreated maps, myths, or secret messages. Women, too, rebelled with hair. In Sparta, unmarried women famously wore their hair short, in contrast to the long locks of other Greek women, an expression of independence and readiness for physical activity. Roman women occasionally rejected the latest courtly trends to align with philosophical ideals such as Stoicism or early Christianity, embracing simpler, modest styles. And when emperors fell, their hairstyles fell with them. Cutting one's imperial style hair could be a dangerous but bold statement of political allegiance or dissent. In all these cases, hair wasn't merely a mirror of the world. It was a tool to reshape it. Across ancient civilizations, when voices were silenced or swords were drawn, the scalp became a canvas of resistance, a braid, a buzz, a curl. It could shout louder than words ever dared.